To say, and I'm not making any political points, this is exactly how I feel, but the European Union that I see represented by some in this House is not the European Union that I have experienced and that I know well. The European Union of representatives of their countries who come together in order to reach a compromise to serve the greater good and the greater number of people. Governments coming together in the Council of Ministers to work together, to vote together. And if there is a big issue, it's that those governments who, when they vote in the Council of Ministers, very rarely reveal to their national parliaments how they voted. And the pooling of sovereignty voluntarily to achieve far greater than they would achieve by acting alone. This is the European Union that I know. Working with colleagues as the rapporteur on the Schengen movement, ensuring that within that there is no discrimination at the border on pivotal grounds such as race, ethnicity, religion, belief, age, disability, gender, sexual orientation, values, the past, going back to the past, because unless we go back to the past, we will recreate it. I believe the European Union was quite literally born out of the ashes of the Second World War. Others have heard me say this, and I will revisit it again and again. Because countries decided that they would no longer fight one another for land, power, coal, steel, that they would work together, and that they recognized that the ashes of the Second World War, the ashes from people's hopes, people's dreams, from crematoria that were dotted across Europe, there was a determination that we would never look away again. Whilst a group, a minority, or a country was targeted and scapegoated. And that, my lords, is deeply personal to me. Because if I, as a gay man, had been living in certain parts of Europe during the Second World War, I could literally have been taken to those camps and have been worked to death. And what happened to others? What happened to people on the basis of their religion? The 6 million plus Jews who were obliterated because of their religion. I must connect with them and connect with others. And if there is discrimination and the rise of the right wing in Europe now, and in countries that have been cited, isn't it all the more reason why we need to work together to ensure that that is brought to an end? Not that we turn away and say, only the things that matter to Britain are the things that I'm concerned with. What makes us human is our ability to stand in the shoes of the other and say, would I want that to happen to me or my children? Now, I can see certain members on the front bench getting perhaps a little impatient with me. What is his point? And don't mumble from a sedentary position. If you have something to say, please stand and say it. I will always give way. The reason I've decided to speak today, after a long silence from my original initiation in the early debates, is that no one has failed to mention those individuals within the groups who at the moment are facing appalling uncertainty. The 3 million EU citizens who live in this country, if for no other reason that this insurance policy, this bill before us today, gives them a degree of certainty and hope, then if for no other reason, I would grab this bill with both hands. And as the Right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Leeds, said, what about the division? By going for a no-deal Brexit, what happens to the 16 million plus like me, who with our values feel completely disconnected from our country? Do we heal the division there? No. We reinforce it. And therefore, my lords, for no other reason than the ability to stand in the shoes of the others, and yes, those people who voted leave and want a resolution, we have to work together. And therefore, I want to give the Prime Minister that you refer to and others have referred to, who have trust in him, and some of our concerns is that we do not believe what he says. Other noble lords have referred to the reports from the capitals. But if this bill that we have before us today gives the Prime Minister, that most of you seem to have faith and belief in, gives him the time to reach a deal that brings parts of this country together that at the moment seem forever divided, then we should give your Prime Minister this insurance policy of extra time.
Follow the noble Lord Cashman. There are moments when one is reminded of what a privilege it is to be in this place. This debate is actually one of them. I think in particular of what Lord Cashman has just said, how Lord Patten ended with his warning on Northern Ireland, what Lord Cormack said. I think of what Lord Hayne said. I don't intend to address any of the great themes that they touched on today, but I do think it is a privilege to take part in a debate of such calibre. I didn't feel that about yesterday for some reason. I want to just address two themes. One is a constitutional theme and one is a negotiating theme. One is about our domestic affairs and one is about our relationship with the 27. And both arise directly from the terms of the bill that we are debating. Lord Patten, quoting my hero, Kenneth Clarke, yesterday in the House of Commons, referred to an element of disingenuousness in the Prime Ministerial position. I found it very shocking that the documents revealed in the court case in Edinburgh show that the prorogation plan and timing was decided in the middle of August, and for another 2 weeks the number 10 spokesman denied that there was or could be any such plan. I find it very shocking that the Prime Minister, when the plan became clear, when the proclamation issued, the Prime Minister maintained that his motives had nothing to do with Brexit. Nobody in the country believed that, but to me it was still shocking to see in these documents, in the case in Edinburgh, that it was precisely about Brexit, that it was knowingly and deliberately about Brexit. Ken Clarke, disingenuous. We have here an issue of trust. The number 10 spokesman said this morning that if the bill that we are debating now became an act, the government, the Prime Minister, would not abide by it. I would assume he misspoke, but we recall Mr. Gove last Sunday discussing with Andrew Marr and refusing to say that the government would implement the law of the land. They would wait and see what it said. We saw on the same day that among the clever plans that Mr. Cummings was cooking up was simply not sending the bill for royal assent. This is not exactly the good chap's theory of government. I find it difficult to deal with this issue of trust. I spent a long time in the public service, and one did not see one's political masters being disingenuous, telling lies. One saw them avoiding answering difficult questions. One found ways of helping them avoid answering difficult questions. One gave them answers to other questions which might be suitable. But one never drafted a lie. I don't think that in 36 years in the public service I ever told a lie. It's a very stupid thing to do, telling a lie, because it creates a subsequent problem of trust. People don't know. So we are legislating against a very peculiar background. I was very interested by the Noble Lord, Lord Howard's discussion of legitimacy. This was an opposition bill. This was I find that discussion more interesting than the historical disquisition, where I didn't entirely share his views. I didn't share his views at all on the discussion of legitimacy. A bill is a bill. If a bill has been passed by the House of Commons and comes to us here, it's legitimate. It is the voice of the House of Commons. If we approve that bill, that then is Parliament. The two houses of Parliament. It doesn't matter who drafted the original. It's legitimate. And it would be wholly illegitimate for the government to decide to do what Mr. Cummings hinted it would do, which is just sit on it, not send it to the palace, or what the spokesman this morning said it would do, which was ignore it. Now, I think that is a major constitutional issue. And when the government reply to this debate, I would hope that they would confirm that if this bill is tomorrow passed by this House, it will be sent forward for royal assent, and once it has received royal assent, it will be acted on. These are ridiculous questions to have to ask in our parliamentary democracy, but such is the issue of trust that I feel one has to ask them. Second point, second theme, the relationship with the European Union. In the scripts that were read out to us yesterday,
perhaps it's helpful to the Noble Lord if I inform him that as part of the agreement last night, we did say that if the bill is passed, becomes an act, then in the House of Commons on Monday, it would be available and sent for royal assent.
It will be sent forward for royal assent. It will then be acted on. And nobody asked that question yesterday because it's an absurd question. I only ask it because the number 10 spokesman said today that it would not be acted on. The Prime Minister would not abide by it.
The reason I used that form of wording, one of the original proposals was that we would guarantee that it would receive royal assent, but obviously we cannot speak on behalf of the palace, so we merely said that we would enable it to be sent for royal assent. I think the original guarantee that we were asked for was that it would receive royal assent by Monday evening. We could not give that guarantee because obviously it depends on the availability of Her Majesty. So we would send it for royal assent if it becomes an act.
Can I just ask, but of course it would be open to the Her Majesty's ministers to advise her to give royal assent, and that's what would happen, I assume. Can that be confirmed?
Could I repeat to the Noble Lord the question that Mr. Marr put to Mr. Gove? Will the government act on the law of the land if this bill becomes an act receiving royal assent?
Yes. The government will abide by the law.
Yes, yes.
Can I just remind the Noble Lord that the last monarch to refuse royal assent was Queen Anne over 300 years ago. Subsequently, every act passed by Parliament has been submitted and has received royal assent.
I wanted to move on to the European theme and negotiation. The scripts that were spoken to yesterday by a number of Noble Lords contained the familiar argument that the Prime Minister has been using extensively, that the legs would be knocked out from under his negotiating strategy if no deal was taken off the table. Now, I've spoken on this before, and I don't want to bore the House. I believe that is completely untrue. I believe that to say that if you don't give me what I'm asking for in a negotiation, I will shoot myself. That is not a credible threat. We know that the pain is asymmetric. We know that although everybody is damaged by a no-deal, crash-out Brexit, it is the United Kingdom which is damaged hugely more than anyone else. We know that, and they know that. We know that there is a problem of asymmetric preparation. They are better prepared than we are, even although they have proportionately less of a problem than we have. Third point, this is a new point. Everything I've said up to now I've bored the House with before. Here comes a new point. It is now not possible, or it will very shortly be not possible, to get a new deal agreed at the European Council on the 17th of October. I think that the Prime Minister may listen too much to Mr. Cummings, who is an expert on game theory, has studied game theory very closely. I don't think he's done much international negotiation, but he knows a lot about game theory. I believe that what he is playing is the game of chicken, which we know from American movies of the 1560s, where you put your foot hard down on the accelerator, you ideally throw away the steering wheel, and you drive straight at each other, believing the other guy is going to swerve. There are two problems with applying this theory to negotiation of the European Union. One, they are a union. They are 27 member states. It takes them a very long time to make a decision to swerve. They need to get instructions in Brussels on whatever you put forward. They need then to debate that. They need to send the reactions back. They need to hear what the government then thinks. The idea, which was in today's papers, that Mr. David Frost yesterday in Brussels was saying the British couldn't put forward any proposals now because they would be attacked by the ERG and they would be published by the European Union and criticised in the Article 50 working group. Well, that's probably true. Both elements of that are true. But that shouldn't mean that you don't put forward any proposals. When Barnier says paralysis, and our Prime Minister says remarkable progress, wonderful progress, the question of disingenuousness creeps in again. I tend to believe Mr. Barnier. I find it harder to believe our Prime Minister, which is a very worrying thing to say. But it will take them a lot of time. Any proposals that are going to be discussed on the 17th of October ought certainly to be being negotiated now with the Article 50 working group. Now, it's my belief, actually, that Mr. Cummings, in addition to believing in the game of chicken, he actually doesn't mind if we have a no-deal crash-out. In fact, I think, given what Mr. Farage has been saying, he may actually see benefit in a no-deal crash-out. Mr. Farage has been saying that if the Conservative Party negotiates some new variant of Mrs. May's withdrawal agreement, then they will run against that. They will run against the Conservative Party in every Conservative-held seat. Whereas, if Mr. Johnson sticks to his promise to go deal or no deal, do or die, on the 31st with no deal, various forms of pact, informal or formal, are possible. That is what Mr. Farage is saying. I have a theory that Mr. Cummings may be listening. So it seems to me that we have, in addition to the problem of trust, in respect of the text of the document that we're looking at now, the bill, We also have a problem of whether it will be interpreted not just in the letter, but in the spirit. One can think of various ways in which the Prime Minister, obliged to write this letter, and the Noble Lord Callanan is confirming that the Prime Minister would feel obliged to write the letter that this Act requires him to do in the circumstances, if they arose, set out in Section 1 of the Bill. He could send that letter and make sure that the European Union did not agree. The European Union need unanimity. He could talk to a friend in, say, Budapest. He could also, he's a classicist, he could put his oral presentations in a num rather than a nonny way. He could make sure that the European Union, by adding threats, by adding undertakings of what we intend to do, he could make sure that we don't get the extension that we have required him, if the circumstances arose, to seek. So the problem of trust is quite a big one here. And I think that it would be very good if the government, in responding to this debate, would say not only that they will act on the law, but they will act on the law in the spirit in which the House of Commons passed the law. Now, the Noble Lord Brown suggested that we would be going cap in hand to the European Council, and who knows what terms we could obtain. That's a bugbear. Honestly, you're either in the European Union or you're out of the European Union. There is no middle position which we could be put into. The Noble Lord implied, perhaps I got him wrong, he implied that for the period of any extension, the terms of our membership would be for the 27 to decide. No, sir, we are either a member with the full rights of a member or we're not in. I am very sad that we are not exercising the full rights of a member anymore. I am very sad that from the 1st of September there are important working groups, important meetings of Coreper and important councils in which the British are following the policy of the empty seat. It did the French no good when General de Gaulle tried it. It will do us no good. Wherever we're going to be, in, out, close, far from the European Union, it must be in our interest, up to the last possible moment, to exert as much influence as we can on the direction and legislation of the European Union. So I would say that that's my answer to Lord Brown, that if we can put ourselves in a half-in, half-out position, the European Union can't. But I am nervous that we have not necessarily solved the problem with this bill, for which I shall vote, because it seems to me that in addition to the risk that the government don't act on the bill, there may be a bigger risk that the government act on the bill in a disingenuous way, and therefore the purposes set out in the bill may not be achieved.
Can I draw attention? I think it's crossbenchers have just had a... Right. Can I draw my Noble Lord's attention to my entries in the register, from which you will see that I am now in my 41st year with an appointment in Brussels, 25 as an MEP and the last 15 in other capacities. What it will not tell you is that for the 19 years previous to that, when I left school at 16, I worked in international organisations, firstly in the Crown Agents for the Colonies, then for a brief period in a junior position in the Foreign Office, and then for the cooperative movement. My whole life has been devoted to multilateralism, and it has always been a difficult proposition. From the East African Common Services Organisation in 1961, the first multilateral body I came across, to today, there have always been opportunities for misunderstandings, for clashes, for different cultures. But the important thing is that multilateralism has worked. Multilateralism has been of great benefit in many different areas of this world. I do not believe that if we left the European Union, the world would end. We would, of course, survive. We are a big and strong country, but it would be fundamentally the wrong decision to take. And Lord Campbell, very early on in this debate, said exactly what I feel. I see this bill as being a transitional demand, to quote someone who may be better known on those benches than on these, and it's a transitional demand because I want to stay in the European Union. This prolongs the time that we're in, and I have never hidden that. I see next to the noble Lord Cameron, my friend, Baroness Smith, who served with me on the Cambridge Says Yes committee, where we got well over 70% voting to remain. And we, in Cambridge, when we were arguing for the referendum, I did not argue about money or about the fact that we could do this or we could get that. It was a straightforward moral proposition that it is right to be in a multilateral organisation, it is right to cooperate with your friends, and you have to realise that the pooling of sovereignty is the gaining of sovereignty. We speak as though it's a one-way street. It's not. It's a two-way street, and more comes towards us from cooperation than flows away. Now, the Labour Party last night decided that it did not wish to support an election until this bill is passed. I hope that when it is passed, the Labour Party will support an election, because the House of Commons is now ungovernable. The government is in a minority of 20, thanks to its own foolish actions, and it cannot get anything through anymore. We have to have an election. And let me say this, a lot of my friends are among the 20 suspended. But don't just concentrate on them. I am, for my sins, the president of my local party in Cambridgeshire. I would say that roughly 20% of our members are actively on strike, or as we put it, withdrawal of enthusiasm. We'll be lucky if we get a window bill up. Last night, I spoke to one of them who said, well, I'm going to keep it quiet, Richard, but I'm going to vote Lib Dem at the election. Now, you can see the situation in which this politics of confrontation have pushed our party. And it is a tragedy, because these are people who at heart are Conservatives, often with a smaller rather than a larger C, but they basically believe in the principles of the Conservative Party, and they feel they're being forced out of it. And only an election can settle this. And I would ask the parties opposite and the SNP to come to some sort of agreement as to how this is to be resolved. My personal conclusion is that it probably has to be another referendum, because the people have spoken once, and it would be bitterly resented if the politicians took the decision without consulting them again. On the other hand, if the people return a coalition government, that has to be part of the coalition programme, and then you can get a referendum bill through. It might take a month or two, but I mentioned that I have these jobs in Brussels. It gives me an office in the European Parliament. I have a staff there, only one of whom is British, so I have a fair amount of international exposure. If the British government was to ask for an extension to have another referendum, it would be given. You wouldn't need a bill in the House of Commons or the House of Lords. The EU would be pleased to give an extension for the purpose of having a referendum. Where they are not very happy is giving an extension so that we can carry on arguing. Because, as they say, and the point has been made on several occasions, Nothing is being put on the table. When I go to Brussels, which is generally twice a month, and I hear the gossip around is, what on earth are they up to? Who is this new Prime Minister of yours that is hell-bent on destruction? And that is the image that is coming across. So what I would say is that you've got to get your act together, colleagues opposite, and you've got to bring into the election something which resembles a party deal on the future and on a way forward. Because let me just finish by saying, I said we could leave the EU, it would be difficult but not disastrous. But we also were members of the Council of Europe, where the British government has played a uniquely destructive role in opposing its budget, where the Court of Human Rights has had to be cut back because the British and Mr Salvini from Italy, now mercifully consigned to history, were obstructing even an increase in line with inflation. So we've got to deal with the multilateral bodies better. We should be saying more about the WTO, where the United States is threatening to bring the whole appeals procedure to a halt by refusing to appoint judges. And, of course, there are so many other multinational organisations that we belong to. I remember when my friend, the Lord Judd, was a Navy Minister, and he probably has forgotten this, but many years ago we were discussing NATO, and I'm not sure whether he said to me or I said to him, we could never have a referendum on NATO because it's too central to Britain's interests to have it tossed around in the political field. I feel that the referendum that we had on the EU was a fundamental mistake. Yes. We have now made the mistake, but it is our duty to undo it. You wouldn't go to a hospital and say to the doctor, I'm sorry, let me tell you how to take the appendix out or how to do the heart transplant. There are some things, and we have to accept, that the political class may actually know how to do. And on occasions, democracy has to be qualified. That's an unpopular thing to say, but it happens to be absolutely right. On occasions, democracy has to be qualified, and you sometimes have to say to people, I'm terribly sorry, I hear what you say, but you're wrong.
Pleasure to follow with Noble Lord Bath. We have before us a bill concerned with avoiding a no-deal Brexit, and like the noble and right Reverend Prelate, the Bishop of Leeds, who I think is not in his place, I've also been taking note of a timely and helpful report from the academics in the UK and a Changing Europe Research Unit. I'm sorry, I do see. Sorry, apologies, I didn't see that. From the academics in the UK and a Changing Europe Research Unit, which is about the issues, implications and the impacts of leaving the EU without a deal. And at this point, I declare my interest in King's College London as set out in the register. I rise in support of this bill, and I'll confine my remarks to explaining why I believe it's so important to avoid no deal. The report I mentioned usefully reminds us that while the Prime Minister's no ifs, no buts, no maybes approach is presented as offering a clean break and allowing us all to just get on with it, it is in reality nothing of the sort. It's not, as the no deal, as the report says, is not a neat way of resolving a complex problem, but a way of rendering a complex problem infinitely more so. No one should delude themselves that no deal will in itself be the end of the story. There is no realistic possibility, and indeed no suggestion from anyone on any side of this debate, that we will not have a future relationship with a bloc of countries that represents our largest trading partner and our nearest neighbours. So no deal won't be the end of negotiations, but the beginning of a new, more complex and likely even more prolonged set of negotiations. And without them taking place under the framework of a deal, do we really think those negotiations are going to be any easier? In this scenario, any future deal will almost certainly require unanimous agreement from all member states and ratification by their own parliaments. And these negotiations will all be set against a backdrop of bruised and damaged relationships, both within the UK itself, as we are already seeing, but also between the UK and the EU. Leaving with a deal would mean a transition period during which trade would continue as now, while the two sides negotiated a future relationship. No deal means a cliff edge, with the UK treated by the Union as a third country. And the impact on trading goods would be immediate, with new regulatory and customs arrangements coming immediately into force. This would mean disruption to supply chains, impacting crucial sectors like food, medicines, and just-in-time manufacturing. Larger businesses might be able to withstand the storm. Smaller companies are unlikely to have the reserves to do so. Trade in services, always the Cinderella of the Brexit story, would be hit particularly badly. If the UK exits without a formal deal, it will no longer be covered by the services agreement of the European Economic Area, but will have its trade with the EU governed by the General Agreement on Trade in Services, a treaty under the WTO. GATS, as the acronym goes, provides far less access than the current EEA arrangements and therefore fewer opportunities for the UK services sector. And this disadvantage will be compounded by another challenge. The professional qualifications will no longer be automatically recognised in other European countries. Under the EEA, UK qualifications are subject to mutual recognition agreements. So if you're a UK qualified accountant or architect, you can provide services in other EU countries. Under no deal, this would immediately cease to be the case. So professional services suppliers would have to apply not just to have their qualifications recognised, but also for working visas. My Lords, this is a sector which is the second largest services exporter in the world, with 2018 services exports valued at £283 billion, or 45% of total UK exports. And of this, £117 billion were exported to the EU. And this is a sector, let's not forget, that provides 1 in 5 jobs up and down the UK. My Lords, there's also no clarity on what no deal will mean for freedom of movement from November the 1st, and recent government pronouncements, I'm afraid, have not made things any clearer. The Noble Lord, Lord Cashman, has already referred to the concerns of the 3 million EU27 citizens currently resident here. But without a deal, what new rules will apply? And how are employers, landlords, or providers of public service supposed to apply them? And the profound sense of insecurity that EU citizens currently feel in this country is no doubt shared by those Britons resident in other European countries, for whom the position is perhaps even more complex and unclear. A further little discussed consequence of no deal is the immediate loss of access to EU databases and other forms of cooperation, including the European Arrest Warrant, the Schengen Information System, and Europol. And in a world where data is key, this is going to present very real challenges to policing, to security operations, and I'm afraid it will also provide a welcome window of opportunity to criminals intent on illegal access to and use of data. And then, of course, there's the island of Ireland, almost certainly the greatest and most serious unknown at this point, and already discussed in real and compelling detail by other noble lords today. Of course, many of the worst possible consequences of no deal, severe disruption to road, air, transport links, will be averted in the short term because of temporary workarounds which the EU has put in place. But some of these expire as soon as the end of December, just 2 months into no deal. And it's interesting to speculate what will happen to those temporary workarounds at that point, when we could well be engaged in an unedifying dispute over monies due under a so-called divorce bill. My lords, whatever happens, we will, as the noble and right reverend prelate, the Bishop of Leeds, suggested, eventually come through. But we cannot pretend there will not be significant costs to no deal, socially, culturally, and economically. Earlier research from the academic research unit I mentioned earlier found that trading with the EU on WTO terms would, after 10 years, reduce the UK's per capita income by between 3.5 and 8.7%, and they are not the only credible sources coming to a similar conclusion. And so, my lords, I'd ask that as we consider this bill today, we are under no illusions that no deal would provide closure on this sorry period in our nation's history. It would be just the beginning of a process that will not be easy, that will be time-consuming, that will be politically fraught, and that will damage our economy. And let's not forget the inevitable reductions in public spending that will be the consequences of economic downturn will hit hardest those people who are least able to stand it, the poorest, the most vulnerable, and the marginalised in our society. And for all these reasons, I rise to support this bill.
My Lords, it's somewhat difficult to follow on after some 4 hours of debate, because I would like to pick up on comments that some other people have made, and I certainly don't want to duplicate many of the comments that have been made earlier. This is actually the first time I've ever participated in a debate on the referendum, the withdrawal and the like. I therefore don't face the problem that Lord Patton referred to, my noble friend, of repeating myself from other speeches, because it is the first time I've made the comments. I voted Remain, but I am absolutely committed to finding a solution to leave. And that's where I disagree very strongly with some of the speeches that have been made here earlier, Lord Balfe, my friend Lord Balfe and Lord Cashman, for example, who were going on, referring to the disadvantages associated with leaving. I recognise those. But as far as I'm concerned, the referendum delivered a decision. And I very strongly disagree with those who argue for a second referendum. Just by dragging something out, one doesn't necessarily negate the original decision. So I do find myself in disagreement with the Liberal Democrat position and some other noble lords who've spoken today. I find myself in strong disagreement on a number of occasions with the EU negotiations. I find them to be at times arrogant and dismissive, and I still hope that we will find a solution in relation to the backstop, because that is the nub of the problem. The noble Lord Howell has identified some solutions. They may not work, but what I do believe is that we should try and find one, even at this late hour. Having made comments about the EU and the Liberal Democrats, my observations about the Labour Party's negotiations is that I've been unclear throughout as to where they actually stood. I'm not referring to those in this House, but I'm referring to the general Labour Party's position. It's lacked clarity, it's lacked assistance, and therefore has not helped in terms of moving towards a leave solution. But I speak today as a Conservative peer, and therefore it behoves on me to look at the position in relation to the Conservative Party. Because essentially we are discussing a bill which says we do not trust the government in its current position. That's the essence of what this bill is actually saying. And unfortunately, I've come to the conclusion, and it hurts me to say it as a member of the Conservative Party, but I'm moving to that same position in relation to the current government. Now, why have I come to that conclusion? Because I can understand all the disagreements with this particular bill that Lord Brown and Lord Bridges and others have made. But we're in a position whereby we're being told by the Prime Minister that he wants a deal. But at the same time, he announces that, well, we're going to prorogue Parliament. Well, on Monday, the Prime Minister is due to be in Dublin meeting the Taoiseach. What is the point of saying to the Taoiseach, oh, I'm coming over to negotiate? By the way, as I indicated earlier in my intervention on Lord Dane, I don't have a plan. I've got nothing on the table. But I'm coming over. But at the same time, I'm going to call a general election. A general election which will take up 6 weeks of the negotiating period through to the 31st of October. Now, if I was the Taoiseach, I'd pick up the phone to number 10 and say, don't bother. Don't bother to turn up. But of course, the phone call is likely to go through to the gentleman that has been referred to on a number of occasions during this debate. And if it does, we can imagine the courtesy with which that call will be received. The same courtesy that Mr. Clark received when he made a phone call only a few days ago. And I do find it utterly unacceptable. And it's one of the reasons why we lack trust, not only in this chamber, but in the other chamber, and growingly in the nation at large. I find it unacceptable that the Chief of Staff, who advises on these matters, whether it be negotiations or whether it be on the timing of the general election, and here I do disagree with both Lords Balfe and Lord Bridges, because as far as I'm concerned, I'd say to the Labour Party, don't have the general election until after October the 31st, because I don't actually believe what is going on in terms of the negotiations. But is it really acceptable that as the Chief of Staff at number 10 Downing Street, we have somebody who was found in contempt of the Commons? I have here the report of the Committee of Privileges, which received the documentations from a select committee chaired by a Conservative Member of Parliament. The Committee of Privileges is chaired by a member of the Labour Party. And their conclusions are absolutely clear and damning. That report was then put to the Commons, some 5 days after it was received. And on the 2nd of April, Dominic Cummings was found in contempt of the House and of the committee, without a vote. In other words, it was accepted by the whole House of Commons. I do find unacceptable that somebody should be advising the Prime Minister on how you handle parliamentary procedure, who so recently was found to be in contempt of our practices and of members of Parliament. So for those reasons, I have difficulty with this bill because there are problems associated with it. But I understand what it is saying. And I would say to number 10 now, understand what is being said by the formation of this bill and change your behaviour immediately, because that trust must be restored in both houses.
I would like to build on a lot of the previous speakers, in particular my former boss, Lord Kerr, who covered many of the areas I want to go on, and Baroness Bull, who mentioned the economic costs of no deal, where all I would say is I completely support what she said, and you'll find there are other institutions that have done it, like the Institute for Fiscal Studies and Trade Knowledge Exchange, but I have to then refer to my register in the House of Interests because I'm all over both of those. Also, I should warn the House that you might want to be careful about listening to me, in the sense that Lord Kerr referred to the number 10 spokesman role, and the fact that the number 10 spokesman occasionally, and I had to do this for, remember, 4.5 to 5 years, occasionally has to prevaricate and possibly not answer the question as, how shall I put it, as fully as one might like to. However, it has to be said, the number one rule is you never lie. You never, ever lie. And I really worry, having heard about the August the 15th thing on the prorogation, what the implications are for, was that civil servant knowingly not telling the truth, in which the implications are fairly clear, that person should be sacked, or were they being told untruths? And that, to me, is important. It builds on this question of trust, and it builds on the question that Lord Howe mentioned, the whole good chaps theory of government, which I think is very important. On the good chaps theory, alas, we don't have Lord Heseltine with us. Sorry, Lord Hennessy of Nympsfield, a very good friend, here with us to talk about his own theory. But it is worth remembering, when he talked about the decline of this, that he said the good chap theory fell into fragments on August the 28th at Balmoral. Yeah. Right. And to my mind, there are wider implications about what's going on here, because the events of last night, where I won't say the word happy, but I was here right the way through, listening to my former colleague, Lord True, who with passion used to speak when we were in number 10 together on various subjects of policy, speaking passionately about the importance of the rules under which this House operates. He was a bit more concise in the past, I would say. The main point, I think, however, is that I am not a fan of filibusters or guillotines, and I think that's also a symptom of the decline of this business of trust. And picking up what was said before about trust in prime ministers, I think that's crucial, that we actually have to trust our prime ministers, and I do worry that we are in a really dangerous world now. Let me give you some evidence here. When you ask people about trust, this has happened most recently, there is one profession that over the last 35 years has had the biggest rise of any profession in its rating on trust. I am very proud to say that profession is the civil service. However, the latest survey on trust reveals the biggest ever gap in the public's mind between the extent to which they trust civil servants and the extent to which they trust ministers. That is not a good place for our democracy to be. And this whole process, I think, is causing great problems of that kind. Moving on to, I think, the other constitutional point that's really important to remember about this bill is actually there's someone we have to thank for being in this position to even consider this question, and that is the Conservative and Liberal Democrat coalition. Because if it were not for the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, the Prime Minister could have just stopped it all, gone and allowed us to leave with no deal and had an election after that date. Now, I'm the first person to admit that that bill, that act, could be a lot better. And I look forward to amending that at some point and being part of that in this House to correct the things that aren't quite right about it. It was rushed too much, let me put that way. But it is interesting to look back on that. When you look at what the implications of this bill will be, I've seen that the Prime Minister has said it makes it harder if we take out no deal for him to get a deal. And I actually believe the opposite is true, and I'd be really interested in reactions to this, because I've said this publicly already. When I heard Davis talking about this, he said it's absolutely clear that getting rid of the backstop is not enough for me to support this bill, any deal that came to the Commons. And he gave the implication that we'd also have to do something on the money and also something on the courts, the jurisdiction, European courts. And he implied that there were lots of other MPs who took this view. Now, if this is true, I don't think it's possible for such a deal to be negotiated with the EU. I think we've already heard it's impossible to get all of the backstop done. So to get this and all of the others, therefore what they're saying is, Prime Minister, go and negotiate a deal. By the way, when you come back, we're going to vote against it. Now, what does that do for the incentives of the EU to offer any concessions? Absolutely none. What does that do for our process of trying to come up with a deal? It makes it incredibly hard for that to come through. So I don't really understand what we're doing here, because the incentive structure, if you are someone, an MP in the House of Commons, whose preference is no deal, then the obvious thing to do is whatever the deal the Prime Minister comes back with, you just vote against it. And if this bill doesn't exist, the default is quite clear in law. We would then leave without a deal. So the incentive is to vote against it, irrespective of what it is. So I am completely puzzled by it. But let's try and be constructive. What is the way forward from this? And a number of people have said, look, Parliament has had plenty of time to come up with not just what it doesn't want, but what it does want, and has failed miserably. And I think that's true. Therefore, my solution to this is a new Parliament. We therefore need a general election of some kind. The one thing I would say about the general election is please, please, could all of those manifestos be absolutely clear about what you're going to do, right? That to me is crucial, because if you're trying to get the people to make an informed choice and you give them fudge, then we could be back in exactly the same place as we are now. So that's my desperate desire. A final point on, one on some people saying the EU is this terrible club, but it does seem to have a lot of members keen to join it. Secondly, on the question of special advisors, I have spent a lot of my time dealing with special advisors. And my general principle is that good special advisors are extremely good for the smooth working of the civil service and their relationship with ministers. Bad special advisors are toxic and in the end bring their ministers down. And I think that is a lesson the Prime Minister might want to consider.
May I congratulate Lord Rooker in so eloquently moving this bill that, as we know, did achieve a sizable majority in the other place. Like Lord Cashman and Baroness Ludford and a number, we were all members of the European Parliament. I also had the honour to advise Conservative members of the European Parliament for 5 years. And I think the same year as Baroness Ludford, we were stagiaires in the European Commission together. Not something I would care to mention in polite Conservative company in the present climate. And for the reasons that my noble friend Lord Hayward said, I have no intention of calling number 10 anytime soon at this time. I would just like to make a few personal remarks as to why my policy on Europe has been so strong and remains as strong as it did. I've always considered myself to be a Scot by birth, British by nationality, and European. And the only comfort I take from the debates like this we've heard, both today and on other occasions, is that we're assured that we won't be leaving Europe. And yet, many of my friends, particularly parliamentary friends in the other place, are quite keen to prevent us from remaining and reapplying bodies such as the European, the EEA, the European Economic Area and the European Free Trade Area, because of connotations to do with the customs union and the single market. I also regret that many of the opportunities I had to be a stagiaire, to practice European law, albeit briefly, in Brussels, to be a member of the European Parliament, will be not open to the present and future generations in this country. I am proud to speak, some more fluently than others, a number of other European languages, and it's always been a source of concern to me that that is not something that we applaud and not something that we encourage, but almost it's considered a bit of a crime that we speak a foreign language and one's loyalty is questioned for that reason. Now, I would argue very strongly why this bill is needed, and I will end, if I remember, with a question, if I may, to the Minister, summing up the debate today. Now, we have a very short bill, very focused, and followed up by a letter to the President of the European Council from our current Prime Minister. It puts a deadline on it that obviously is a focus of some contention in the debate today, of the 31st of January 2020 or earlier if agreement is reached on a deal. Now, I would argue that prorogation is premature. It was my distinct understanding that we faced a 2-year parliamentary session that was longer than usual, but with the distinct purpose of fulfilling our legislative duty in both houses of Parliament of passing those bills that were required not just to prepare us, but businesses, like referred to by Lord Wigley, who I'd like to consider a noble friend, such as hill farmers, who are particularly concerned. And I know the Upland Alliance have had a series of meetings with at least 100 hill farmers up and down the country in England. And like Lord Kerr, I feel it a privilege to have a seat in this place and a privilege to participate in debates like this, because as we say when we're introduced here, we have a voice and we can speak for those, even though we don't have a constituency. We can raise the concerns of those. Now, we learnt this week that the Agriculture Bill will fall. We haven't even seen the Environment Protection Bill, the Immigration Bill, the Trade Rollover Bill is blocked in the other place. We have yet to see the second trade bill. All of these have implications for the farming community. We haven't yet seen the Fisheries Bill. Why on earth then are we concluding prematurely, in my view, this parliamentary session until we've had the chance to thrash out what the detail will be? Now, in the spending review yesterday, there's some 400 and something million allocated to DEFRA to prepare, because obviously we've passed all the statutory instruments, I believe, and some of them we've had to correct because we passed them rather quickly, but timelessly. But there is a reference to 30 million of support, I understand, both in this year and more particularly next year. That raises the question, what is the legal basis for that sum of money? But my greater concern, why we need the Agriculture Bill in particular, is how can farmers who have concluded one harvest and are about to sow a winter crop with a view to sowing summer wheat early next year, how can they possibly make a decision, a commercial decision, until they know what the level of support will be? I would argue that arable farmers are probably the least likely to need or to benefit from future support. The contrary is the case with the hill farmers. They need to know whether they actually produce lambs and put the ewes to tup this autumn, whether there will be a market for them. I believe that Parliament, both houses, owe it to them to give them a certainty as to know whether there will be a market, and many will be preparing for sales in France of spring lamb next year. I'd like to respond to something that I thought was quite provocative and evocative that Lord Howard said, who I greatly admire, and I was the shadow minister under his leadership in the other place for a number of years. I firmly believe, and I'll say this as someone who's not dissimilar to Lady Mayor, not quite as exotic heritage. I had a Scottish father, a Danish mother. They met on a blind date, so I'm obviously very keen on blind dates, in Hamburg, where both found themselves allocated after the war. It was my distinct understanding when I did both history and more especially as a student of J.D.B. Mitchell in Edinburgh University, and I was the first intake to do a 6-month obligatory course on European Community Law. And I'm absolutely bewildered that now the Edinburgh University Law School and the Law Society is deciding whether we need to continue to have such an obligatory course. Of course we will, because particularly in this period of transition as we come out of the European Union. But the reason that we pooled, the original 6 member states pooled the resources of coal and steel, was precisely because those were the 2 commodities that led to an act of regression leading to 2 major world wars in a space of some 40 years. And that is not coincidental. Further, I would argue that when there was the collapse of the Soviet bloc and Comecon, the economic bloc, collapsed, we in the European Economic Community, as we were at the time, now the single market going forward, were the natural partners, economic partners of those now new member states, comparatively new member states of the European Union. So I'd just like to conclude by saying that, feeling as I do, for personal reasons, I deeply regret the way that my 21 heroic colleagues in the other place have been treated. I hope that they will have the whip restored, and those who wish to will be allowed to fight the next election. I do not believe in a second referendum. I believe the first referendum on this issue was a complete disaster. It led to the death of Joe Cox. I believe that any future referendum would be equally divisive. We just need to go outside the entrance to this building to see why that would be the case. I support this bill. I would vehemently argue why we need the 6 bills that were meant to be set out in this parliamentary session before we prorogue. I would sign up to a general election, but after the 5th of November, when we can actually hopefully agree a deal, and I believe that this bill before us today is instrumental in that regard. My question to the Minister, and I'm sorry he's not in his place today, is that I hope that the Government will abide by the terms of this bill if it is carried by both houses, and the letter in the schedule as well. And can we have confirmation today, not just will the Government apply for an extension in the terms of this bill, but vote for such an extension in the European Council?
This bill is all about preventing no deal, something that I must remind the House that Parliament has made very clear earlier on this year that it doesn't want. And yet the government is still adamant to keep this on the table. And we mustn't forget, for the Brexit Party, it is policy to have a no deal. In June, I was appointed as Vice President of the Confederation of British Industry, the CBI. And while Parliament has been turning itself inside out, something is being lost. Businesses are still struggling with crippling uncertainty, hampering investment and productivity, and the uncertainty that Baroness Neville-Rolfe spoke about. And let's be very clear that no deal would be far worse. Over the past couple of weeks, the CBI has been travelling up and down the country, gauging firms' preparations. And there are 3 things that have come out of this. 1, no deal would not see an end to the Brexit impasse. Instead, we'd be starting negotiating from a worse position. Secondly, larger firms have already spent billions preparing for no deal, but they cannot be protected. They can prepare, but they cannot be protected. And the third thing, we know that smaller firms have neither the time nor the resources to plan properly. And I can give you example after example. Small IT firm, consultancy in the Northeast, they're so worried about their largest customers are manufacturing, distribution, transport, they're putting off decisions because of uncertainty. An East Midlands SME with 110 employees, they're really worried whether the current rules will work or not after October the 31st. A manufacturer making specialist materials in the Northwest, they currently export 91% of their products and import all their raw materials. They've made it very clear their profit will suffer greatly and they will challenge to make investment and to grow in the future. So that's why it's really important that on both sides, if possible, a compromise and a deal could be brought about. And it's businesses that want the certainty, and they want business wants government to get on and deal with the domestic priorities, some of the priorities that the Chancellor, Sajid Javid, mentioned in his statement recently. That's all very good, but Brexit is still overshadowing everything. My Lords, I've always said this time and again over the 3 years, it's not just what we think about what's happening with Brexit, it's about what other people around the world think about us. And I don't know how many noble lords saw this, but there was an open letter published this week. And I'm going to read parts of this letter because it's so important. It says that we, the undersigned national business federations from 8 countries representing over 4 million businesses, are gravely concerned about the possibility of the UK leaving the EU without a withdrawal agreement in place. Companies from our countries have invested trillions of pounds in the UK, supporting jobs, growth and prosperity across the country. We deeply value our economic relationship with the UK, given its favourable business climate, characterised by transparency, regulatory stability, respect for the rule of law, and a long-standing commitment to international collaboration. A decision to leave the EU without a deal would create substantial uncertainty and disruption for businesses, workers, farmers, and regulators alike. The prospect of lengthy waits at the border, restrictions of intra-company transfers of workers, the fragmentation of regulations and standards, or doubts about free flow of data in e-commerce represent significant risks. Significant potential changes to the UK immigration policy also raise concerns. Firms also would be forced to make decisions about supply chains and investments in the UK without knowing what the future terms of trade will be. They will also need to evaluate the legal, contractual and geographic changes needed to ensure their continued ability to serve customers in the UK and across Europe. Such disruptions are bound to affect jobs, consumer choices and the cost of goods and services. The UK walking away from its largest trading partner in an abrupt manner also sends concerning signals to trade partners considering bilateral agreements in the future. We therefore urge the UK and the EU to reach an agreement that includes a meaningful transition period and to swiftly conclude an ambitious agreement regarding their future commercial relationship that supports jobs, growth and prosperity in the UK and across Europe. And who are the signatories, my lords? From across the globe: the Australian Industry Group, the Brazilian National Confederation of Industry, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, the Federation of Egyptian Industries, Japan Business Federation, Federation of Korean Industries, Business New Zealand, and the United States Chamber of Commerce. This is what the whole world thinks that we should be doing. This is beyond what experts think, let alone what the CBI has been saying. My lords, I remember very clearly, just before the election in June 2017, 2 days before, I was sitting next to my old sparring partner, Michael Gove, Chancellor of the Duchy. He was leading the Oxford Union debating team 2 years running, and I was leading the Cambridge Union debating team 2 years running. We were opponents in the annual varsity debate. And I said to him, Michael, we're in this mess thanks to you. He said, Karen, you can't say that. I said, I am saying it, Michael. He said, well, Karen, you'll be thanking me in 10 years' time. Well, this was brought to light in an excellent article that I read in the Daily Telegraph by Jeremy Warner. And he started this, and his article was, "No deal will just prolong the economic certainty, not end it." And he started off by saying he's repeatedly told by his Brexiteer friends that, don't worry, if there's any damage, it's all going to be fine in the long run. Baroness Bull has said, and in a very good speech, there's not just a question of getting over with Brexit. I call this sort of no-deal Brexit, hard Brexit, I call it the Nike Brexit. You know, the clotheswear firm, the sportswear firm, Nike, just do it. The just do it Brexit. Well, just do it and what? The idea that getting it over and done with would provide the finality and certainty everyone so much craves, automatically ushering in a period of economic rebirth, is sadly misguided, is what Jeremy Warner says. And then he uses the example of the currency markets. On Tuesday, it hit the lowest level against the dollar since the 1980s. And the main problem is that Britain's political situation around the world, people are concerned and see it as toxic. A country that has always been respected around the world for stability is now seen as exactly the opposite, as not being stable, and confidence is also draining out of our economy. Economic indicators, according to Jeremy Warner in this article, are flashing red. And we've seen this from economic data that factory output is at its lowest level in 7 years, as Manufacturing Purchase Managers Index shows. In Germany, yes, of course, I hear a lot of the time from people who are very for Brexit, oh, Europe's going nowhere, Germany's going down the tubes, they're going to have a recession. Well, it's bad, because a declining pound in Germany makes it less competitive for them to export to us, one of their biggest markets. And for the UK, the low pound is great for our exports, But the whole concept in economics of import substitution, you don't have import substitutions overnight. You've got to build up your capacity, and that takes many, many years. So the pound's weakness in helping exports is not an instant fillip to the economy or to businesses. And then the main point is we are net importers as a country. So if our currency weakens, our products get more expensive on the supermarket shelves and our consumers suffer. And just as real wages have showed signs of breaking free after the financial crisis, there's a threat that they're now going to sink down again. So this is not Project Fear, my lords. Lord Rooker, Noble Lord Rooker, mentioned the Yellow Hammer report. We still are not getting the full version of this report. Can I ask the government, I don't know if there's going to be a minister responding to this debate, but if the Noble Lord or Noble Lady, the minister, could just tell us, could you...
The Noble Lord raises a very interesting point, because I've noticed that the ministerial bench has been very thinly populated, and I wonder whether the person currently occupying it can tell us whether there will indeed be a ministerial response and where the minister is.
My Lords, there will indeed be a ministerial response, and I think you'll find that my noble friend the Minister will appear very shortly.
I thank the Noble Lord Balfe for that and for the reassurance of response. So could we know if this Yellow Hammer is going to be released to us in full? And then I want to just conclude with this, my lords. There is no running away from this. There are upcoming trading relationships with the EU. You can't run away from the fact that over 40% of our exports go to the EU and over 50% of our imports come from the EU. It is no point saying that the United States as an economy is bigger than the whole of the European Union combined. It is, but it makes up only 18% of our trade. So we need to have a reality check over here. Moving on to WTO terms will not be the panacea at all. The uncertainty will continue. And the irony is, for the EU, any negotiation, here it is, we go out with no deal. Where would the negotiations with the EU start? They would start with money, they would start with citizens' rights, and they would start with the Irish backstop. And they would refuse to engage in any other matters until these three issues are settled. And that's the reality. This deal is not a deal. We haven't even started the real deals. The deals of negotiating our trade, the deals of negotiating our security, the deals of movement of people. All the important things of our future are yet still to be negotiated. So it's essential to prevent no deal. It is wrong to call this bill a surrender bill. You surrender to the enemy. The European Union is not our enemy. They are our best friends. And you stand a much better chance of negotiating if you negotiate in a friendly manner, in an open manner, in a manner when you will be trusted and you trust each other. And I've gone through many negotiations in my business life, and the more amicable they are, the better the results for both parties concerned. So let's just please, the Right Reverend Prelate mentioned Great Britain. Well, Great Britain has always been global Britain. Let's resolve this deadlock and let's continue to be the Great Britain that countries around the world have always respected.
My Lords, it's been a very interesting and wide-ranging debate. I was especially interested in the contribution of my noble friend, Lord Kerr. However, there's not been very much mention in the debate so far of what I would call real people, people outside this chamber. So I would like to focus very briefly on one of the major factors which underlay the outcome of the referendum. I refer, of course, to immigration. My Lords, the immigration issue has not gone away, and it will not go away. There's a lot of talk about the 17 million people who voted to leave the EU, and indeed about the 16 million who voted the other way. I have to tell the House that I am speaking for 30 million people who want to see a reduction in immigration to this country. Now, it's true that the salience of that issue has declined considerably in recent months and indeed years since the referendum. I think there are three reasons for that. One is that many are assuming that Brexit will sort it. Secondly, that the migration crisis in Europe, exaggerated at the time, has somewhat faded. And lastly, in terms of salience, of course, Brexit demolishes every other issue you can imagine. My Lords, I shall be brief, but the public are right to be concerned. I'll mention just 2 points, 2 examples. If immigration continues at current levels, we will be adding 1 million to our population every 3 years. That's the population of Birmingham with all the infrastructure and so on that we need. And secondly, housing. Again, at current rates, we will have to build a new home every 6 minutes, night and day, for the new families who will be joining us. Finally, my Lords, if we look ahead, there is now, and this is the serious point, a serious risk that our last case, as far as immigration is concerned, will be worse than our first. The present government are now proposing an Australian-style points-based system, without apparently realising that we've had such a system for 10 years, and without being aware of the fact, apparently, that the situation in Australia could hardly be more different. It seems that the expression is popular with focus groups, and that is the reason that it is now the basis of policy on a matter of real importance to, as I said, 30 million people. That, my Lords, I find disgraceful. We need a serious attempt to tackle the issues that underlie this. It gets worse, because the government are also contemplating a very significant lowering of the level of skill and also the level of salary that will qualify people from around the world to come to this country. We've calculated that approximately 9 million jobs in the UK will become more open to international competition than they are now. Finally, my Lords, if the outcome of this whole saga is that we merely substitute non-EU workers for EU workers with no significant reduction in the numbers, I believe that confidence in our political system will suffer a very severe blow.
My Lords, this bill should be unnecessary. If we had a government who we could trust and a cabinet that actually took an interest in the real and devastating impacts that no deal will bring to people. This government has no mandate for no deal, and no deal is expressly opposed by the elected House. And yet, this government appears determined, by hook or by crook, and mainly by crook, to impose it upon this country. My Lords, I won't detain the House long. There have been some excellent speeches that have covered many areas and which have brought to light the full impact, whether it's from Northern Ireland and the peace process, whether it's on our farmers, on our businesses. But I just want to raise one particular area, and that is on the British citizens who are living currently in the European Union. Leaving without a deal means they are left with no framework under which they can operate. It is causing huge fear and anxiety amongst British citizens across the European Union. And the one thing that I find most astounding about the proponents of a no deal is that they talk in these broad terms. They say, we've got to get this done, we've got to get it finished. It won't be finished. The misery will just have started for millions of people. And I was particularly impressed by the speeches we've heard which actually addressed the detail. As the noble Baroness McIntosh outlined to us the impact on farmers, as noble Lords Lord Hayne and Lord Mandelson and Lord Patten and others outlined the real impact on people in Northern Ireland,
if we leave without a deal. So I just want us not to forget the impact on British citizens in the European Union, many of whom are in absolute fear. And I just want to share with the House an email I received recently from a British citizen in France, who said, on the 31st of October, I will become a third country national with lack of clarity about my rights, and worse, my ongoing healthcare provisions look decidedly dodgy. Basically, my life quite literally depends on the medication I have to take every day and night and morning, and if anything disrupts my ability to obtain the level of healthcare I currently enjoy, then my life could be threatened. He went on to say, the Boris Johnson government fills me with dread as I witness a boost to the pull-up-the-drawbridges brigade in the Conservative Party. And he finishes, I don't know if you remember, but I worked for the Conservative Party for 30 years, and I have considered myself a Conservative for 63 years, but no longer, as I now feel my party has left me. My Lords, if we leave on the 31st of October with no deal, we will plunge those EU citizens, like the one I have quoted, and many, many hundreds of thousands, millions more, into a situation of fear and concern, where they don't know whether they'll be able to access health services, where the health services of those countries don't know how they will properly be remunerated, and where there is lots of confusion. I ask us, when we are considering the issue of no deal, to always consider the people. This is not an abstract concept. This is about real impact on people's lives. We should not allow no deal to go ahead in this underhand way, and therefore I support this bill.
My Lords.
My noble friend Baroness Bull has very clearly outlined some of the problems, and I'd like to just build on the comments made by the noble Lord Oakes just now, because in terms of reciprocal healthcare alone, we must remember that there are 27 million people who hold a UK-issued European health insurance card. If the 190,000 UK pensioners who live elsewhere in the EU were to return to the UK, the cost of their healthcare alone would be between 500 million and £1 billion a year. And yet, I don't think that we have seen anywhere provision for this kind of movement happening. The BMA have just published a document, and I should declare my interest as a past president, entitled A Health Service on the Brink, the Dangers of No-Deal Brexit, and it is littered with questions that really should have been answered during the years that we've had since the referendum. We currently have nearly 22,000 European graduate doctors in the UK. A third of them have said they're considering leaving. We need reciprocal arrangement for their qualifications. We have 10,000 medical vacancies already. If a third of those doctors go, we're going to have even more. And when people turn up with their sick child, their other family member, and have an even longer trolley wait than they have now, and then their relative has died because they couldn't get the health care they need, that's when the headlines, I think, will change dramatically. Because sadly, I do worry that some of the implications for the individuals in our society really haven't hit home, and in part because we haven't told them openly and honestly what the implications are. I've been privileged enough to be a member of the European Advisory Group to Welsh Government, and as my, and I would say noble friend, the noble Lord Wigley knows only too well, the concern over farmers is absolutely enormous. The concern over fair distribution of food because of our rural areas in the event of shortages is huge. We have a large number of SMEs who create component parts, and they will almost certainly become non-viable in the event of a no deal. Our ports have been trying hard to make provision for the future, but the sudden catastrophe of a no deal will certainly jeopardise our economy in Wales. And Wales already has quite, as is known, socio-economic problems that go back through our history quite a long way. The last point that I would like to make when we're considering the implications of a no deal are to remember all of those groups that we will suddenly drop out of. One of those is the European reference networks that look at rare diseases. Those are the eyes and ears looking to where the disastrous epidemics and pandemics and new diseases are emerging. Without that intelligence, we will have strange conditions just turn up in emergency departments around the country with no information ahead of time. So, for those and many other reasons, and the debate has been long and interesting, I strongly endorse the comments made by my noble friend Baroness Bull and would support this legislation.
Before the noble Baroness sits down, can I ask her about the implications for the structural funds from the European Union? I understand they've been particularly helpful to Wales in the past. Is she confident that they will be replaced?
I'm most grateful to my noble friend for that question, because no, I'm not confident that they'll be replaced. I know that Welsh Government have asked the Westminster Government for evidence that the funding will come through. There was a statement made by the noble Lord Minister in relation to the funding that's come from CAP for farmers, but I think there are many other areas that are really of concern, and I fear that people in Wales may not have been as aware as they might have been of some of the implications, nor were they aware of how important that infrastructure funding has been over the years that we've had previously.
My Lords, just over a week ago, the ministers started to backtrack on a very important announcement made by the Prime Minister 2 weeks previously, which was that he would respond to Angela Merkel on his alternative or way of dealing with the matters raised by the necessity of the backstop. The necessity of the backstop, of course, being that there would need to be some way of continuing with the internal market and the customs union in the context of a border in Ireland, Northern Ireland border. Now, 1 week today, I think it is, when we won't be here, there will be the red letter day for that reply which the Prime Minister has promised to give to Angela Merkel. I'd like to ask the noble Lord the Minister, does he still expect such a reply to be given, or is it another of these commitments which disappears after a few days of media into thin air? Now, what are the things he could have said, or he might still say? Well, it's logical to say, and it is in line with the provisions now of this bill, which will undoubtedly, I think, become an act, which is that another way of looking at the backstop question should be seriously considered, and it is as follows: that in order that we don't have any border on the island of Ireland, and that there is therefore on both sides of that border common membership of the single market and common membership of the customs union, then some people in Northern Ireland say, but there could be a dotted line boundary in the Irish Sea, to which the answer is that the whole of the British Isles needs to stay in the internal market and the customs union. And by the way, that was not only very, very near to being adopted by the House of Commons, but at that time there were a competition of 2 or 3 alternatives to rather similar things. And when people say with a degree of vehemence, of course there's no consensus in the House of Commons to anything remotely like that, but this has not actually been tested in the House of Commons, certainly not in recent times. And it would also deal with the key question, which is posed in many doorsteps in this country, which is along the line, what the Romans ever done for us. And we in the trade union movement, and I was involved heavily in this in the TUC, know that with an internal market it's absolutely essential that you have some way of dealing with the notion that we could be undercut by anybody that is competing with us who are members of the internal market. And the answer to that, given Jacques Delors in 1988, of course, was you have collective bargaining at a higher level, and there is therefore an understanding, an undertaking, by qualified majority voting if necessary, that these various baker's dozen we've had now are very important rights for part-time workers and so on. I won't go through enumerate, but none of this will be possible without the guarantees which can alone be given by staying in the internal market. And that's one of the things that the Romans have done for us. And I would ask the Noble Lord to confirm what he has said previously in a slightly different context. Yes, we will give those guarantees, but how can we believe that the government would give those guarantees? And therefore, we need the whole of the British Isles to stay in the customs union and the internal market.
Lords, I have listened to, I think, 9 hours of debate yesterday and today. I wasn't going to speak, but I somehow think I've got to, because I could have said so many things, and I'm not going to say them. I just want to make 3 points. The first point is I want to thank Lord Rooker and the people in the other place who have put together this bill, because I think it is an example of cross-party working, which may be very important. It's 50 years since I sat in this House in the official box, and I've been observing its proceedings for that period regularly. And I have a sense at the moment that we are in a watershed. Things will never be the same after these Brexit years, not least because Brexit will be with us for 10, 15, 20 years. It will divide the country, whether we leave or whether we stay. And we have a huge problem dealing with it. And part of that problem is that our political institutions are not keeping up with the world that's changing around us. We are going to have to look at ourselves at some point, quite radically, in order to ensure that we can keep up with what's expected of us. And we're not helping ourselves with the way we are carrying business at the moment. But within this, the position of political parties is becoming a problem. I should never talk about political parties. I lack the gene which gives people passion for political parties. I've observed politicians closely. I've been very privileged for a long time, and I have never, ever understood it. I just accept that I'm not one of you. But equally, I know the importance of parties, and I feel both in government and political and party affairs at the moment, there are too many moving parts. Too many fixed points in my structures in my life are no longer stable, no longer reliable. And that is an unnerving feeling. I would just, the dismissal of 21 members of the Conservative Party appalls me, if I'm honest. I'm not a politician, it just appalls me. It is over 50 years since I observed a number of leading Conservative politicians, the noble Lord Howard, the noble Lord Gummer, the noble Lord Lamont, and indeed Mr. Kenneth Clarke in the Cambridge Union. I remember Kenneth Clarke as a blonde, tall, slim chap with a northern accent. And I find it appalling, dismaying. I'm utterly dismayed to find his contribution treated so cavalierly. And it's true, I could go. But within that, I also think that I feel, listening to the debate and watching what's going on, that I'm living in a world that's going mad. I just think too many things. I can't be alone in this. It's not just age, I think it's true. And we need sanity. And there is sanity in this House and within the parties. And I think we're only going to be rescued if sane people can overcome their differences, act in the national interest, and work together. And it may, this bill is an example of it, and I think maybe it's going to lead to a referendum. I cannot see how a general election is going to get us out of our difficulty, because what if it's a hung parliament again? So maybe it's a referendum. That was the first point I wanted to make, which is be true to your parties, but also look at the national interest before your own party interest when needed. The second concern I have is with the need for a view as to what the future of this country is in the world. The world is changing around us fast. We're in the middle of a technological revolution that is greater than, I think, the Industrial Revolution. If you look at just the last 15 years, 15 years ago we did not have smartphones with apps. And now they're an indispensable part of the lives of everybody. And social media are changing the whole political context in which not just this country, other countries, is happening. And I've chaired conferences recently in Cambridge on quantum computing. I have to say I learned that I can chair meetings without understanding a word of what's said. On blockchain, which is even worse, and DNA, CRISPR-Cas9 for those who are interested. The things which are being brought to fruition in the world of research at the moment are going to alter the world more in the next 10, 15, 20 years than the last 10, 15 years, and that has been fast enough. And we, in the political world, political institutions, have to keep up with it and have to understand it. And Brexit is important, but it's not the only change that's happening, and we need to have a view of the world, as the noble Lord Campbell said earlier. We need to have a view of our place in the world and how we're going to cope with it and how we're going to be equipped to deal with it. And it's not my field, but the tectonic plates of world politics are changing. America and China will dominate the scene. Europe will not be the centre of the world as we've thought of ourselves. And the need to have a position in which we can choose between America and China when each of them puts pressure on us is going to be important. We're going to lack company if we isolate ourselves from the rest of Europe by behaving badly towards them and having no deal. And the context of all of this is going to be fundamental for the future of this country in ways which go deeper just than politics and economics. It'll be cultural. I'm hugely bothered by the way in which the word trust has been used. I am used to people trusting government institutions. It's been part of my career to try to uphold trust and ensure that people stay within, know where the boundaries are in a pragmatic way. And one of those boundaries, as the noble Lord, my successor, said just now, has been special advisors. There's been a lot of my time was taken up with special advisors, and I have a question for the government minister when he's replying. It's just a detailed question, but there were, I think there still are, rules governing special advisors. And one of those rules was that they are temporary civil servants and they do not have executive powers. Can the minister assure us that present special advisors are not exercising executive powers? For instance, sacking another special advisor is the exercise of an executive power. Special advisors do not have those powers. If someone purports to sack someone and they don't have the power to do it, is that sacking valid? I assume this has been looked into. The government knows what's going on, but I just raise it because it's a small example of a more general principle, which is that we need to ensure that the codes of conduct, not just gentlemen behaving well, good chaps behaving well, but actually the basic rules of government and codes of government are being observed. And I just feel at the moment, when people feel able to be careless and cavalier with conventions, we ought to be asking questions about whether basic principles are being observed and challenging when not. I think that's enough for now. I could go on at length about the principles at stake today, but so much has been said that I agree with. I won't repeat them. Thank you.
It's been a very useful debate, but I think the House may agree that it is perhaps now time to wind up. It's been a much more constructive debate today than last night, which I give way to the Noble Lord Mackay, if you would like to just
say something. I didn't realise that you were coming near to winding up. I was asking what the proper time was to end this because I wanted to stay near the end so I'd hear the wisdom of others rather than my own. I want to talk a little bit about the history of this matter in the House of Commons and then say a word or two about this bill. Obviously, the question that immediately arose after the referendum whether the result of the referendum should be in fact implemented. The referendum itself didn't contain, as the Supreme Court pointed out, any mechanism for implementing the result, and therefore it was for Parliament to find a way of implementing the result. The Prime Minister of the day, who took over from David Cameron, undertook to implement the result of the referendum. And she set about doing that, indicating principles by which she would be guided, sometimes called red lines. Now, there's one aspect of that that I want to mention. The customs union and the single market were particularly important, but as I understand the present rules of the single market and the customs union, they would forbid a member state from making contracts for trade with others. And therefore, part of the desire in the referendum was to open up trade for the United Kingdom to other jurisdictions on its own. And therefore, some modification, but only some modification, of the customs union and the single market was necessary. I want to particularly mention Northern Ireland because I do believe that that is fundamental, and so far as I'm concerned, it's a most important problem. And as far as I can see, and I've tried to think about it as much as I could, it can only be solved properly by having the same basic rules on both sides of the border. Otherwise, there is bound to be a hard border, and I think I'm right in saying that the European Union rules require that the boundaries of the European Union are set by hard borders. And therefore, if we were to leave without a deal, it seems to me there would be bound to be a hard border in Northern Ireland. And that, I think, would be a disaster, because the nature of the arrangements there are extremely tender, very important, and vital to securing the peace of Northern Ireland. So that's a vital point, so far as I'm concerned. It has been from the beginning, and it remains so. Now, eventually, Mrs. May managed to get an agreement with the European Union, and she put that before Parliament on more than one occasion. Now, I ventured to suggest that one way of dealing with that problem was that if somebody wanted to change any detail or any part, or indeed the whole of that, they should put forward an amendment to the motion to approve it. That would seem to me to be the reasonable way in which such a thing could be done. But so far as I know, that has never happened, and the only amendment that has been put to the arrangement was the amendment that suggested that an alternative should be found to the Irish backstop. Well, that of itself doesn't change the arrangement. You have to answer that. You have to find the alternative. And so far as I know, my noble friend indicated the possibilities, these are quite difficult to completely understand, and I don't think so far, anyway, they have been completely accepted by the government for negotiation. But I sincerely hope that if the government are to proceed with the negotiations, these matters will be brought forward. Now, my lords, the result has been that there has been a lot of discussion in the House of Commons about various matters. The important thing to remember is that the withdrawal agreement is a legal document which has legal effect. There is added to that the political declaration, and that's a document of intention, not legally binding in the same way as the withdrawal agreement. And I had understood that the European Union said they wanted the withdrawal agreement to be fixed before they had substantive discussion on future arrangements. Now, one of the aspects of the present arrangement that Mrs. May negotiated was a period of a year, of 2 years, transition. And that's a very important safeguard from the sort of cliff edges that we've been hearing described in the course of this interesting and, I must say, in some ways, extremely saddening debate. The result, I think, is that nothing has really happened to change that proposal. It has been turned down, but without any explanation of how it could be improved. And I honestly think that the House of Commons has lost an opportunity in that respect. That they had some debates, you remember, and indicative votes about what they wanted. And most of these indicative votes, so far as I remember, were concerned with the political declaration. And indeed, the discussions that took place after the Prime Minister opened them up with Mr. Corbyn were of that kind. That's to say, they were dealing mainly with the political declaration. And that's, agreement on that is not essential to the withdrawal. And I believe that it's important to try to distinguish between these two. And that brings me to this bill. Now, what the bill asks is that the Prime Minister should write to the President of the European Council asking for an extension. When this appeared in the earlier bill, I think I remember pointing out, I hope humbly, that there was no reason given for the extension. Well, this bill has the reason given for the extension, and a very interesting reason it is. It says that this is done, the extension is done, in order to debate and pass a bill to implement the agreement between the United Kingdom and the European Union under Article 22 of the Treaty of European Union, including provisions relating to the outcome of inter-party talks in relation to the political agreement, the political projection. Now, that suggests to me that the proponents of this bill believe that the agreement, which presently exists, and there's only one as far as I know, is to be implemented after it's been further discussed, with a supplementary point about the political declaration. And if that's correct, this bill really goes a very great distance to securing what is required in the way of a withdrawal agreement, which is not a no-deal agreement, no deal without an agreement. It is an agreement which has already been passed by the European Union, and which we have dissented from as in the House of Commons so far, but it looks as though this promises that it will be passed. So in that sense, if I'm right about that, it's quite a considerable bill, this, and it suggests the possibility of very substantial progress towards our deal for taking us out of the European Union. And on that interpretation, I believe that a good deal of the talk that we've had about no deal is set aside by this in a very direct and constructive manner.
My Lords, my Lord.
Since the Lord O'Donnell isn't in his place right now, but before I begin my remarks, I just wanted to mention the problem of SPADs, because it is not only here that they have caused problems. I personally believe that a lot of the problems in Northern Ireland are a result of SPADs, out of control, and their ministers creating a culture that they can function, interrupting the normal flow of business in a department. And I think that's something, as a country, we need to examine, because it has a serious impact on our structure of government. During the debate, a number of members, some of whom have very considerable experience, have been kind enough to refer to the problems in Northern Ireland. And of course, we know that that has been at the core of blockage to progress for quite some time, albeit it is not confined to that, because there are quite a number of members in the other place who see a range of other problems with the withdrawal agreement, and indeed would wish to replace that and indeed have an entirely new negotiation. And I think it's true to say that negotiation has been wrong really from the very beginning. I think it was someone who said that we should have been trying to get more of a cross-party consensus before we started the negotiations. And I have to say to noble lords opposite, their leader was first out of the trap to call for the triggering of Article 50 immediately after the referendum, which seems to have been forgotten in discussions. He was out there wanting that done before we had even got a negotiated position agreed. Now, it does seem to me that one of the danger with the bill, of course, it's most unfortunate it has come. Does it put us into another further period of purgatory where we actually don't get an agreement? My sense is that what we should be concentrating on in Parliament is finding alternatives. We need solutions. We don't need to rehearse the arguments of the referendum debate again and again and again. And may I just point out that in 2015, when the referendum bill became law, there were 554 members of the House of Commons voted for it. And we were no better. So having let Pandora out of the box, we are now confronted because we, for political and party reasons, we let a particular process emerge, which was different to our normal parliamentary process, and then we complain about the problems that are created by it. It has been done by our own hand. We all, on all sides of this House, live in glass houses. And that, I think, is something we need to reflect on as we move forward. But turning to alternatives, I believe there are alternatives. And I have been trying with colleagues for some months now to influence government and to speak to other people to look at what alternatives there might be. The noble Lord Howell of Guildford referred to the Alternatives Working Group, and I understand that their work, I've seen some of it, I haven't read every detail, but I understand it's terribly technically focused. And many of the problems we have in all parts of Ireland are not technical. They go to the heart of what people feel is their identity. There are some who feel that the promise of that they've been shortchanged, that they supported the agreement in 1998, and they feel that this process upsets that. Others who are exploiting it are doing it for absolutely cynical reasons. Sinn Féin is the most anti-European party in Ireland. They have opposed every treaty. They've opposed everything from the 1970s, and their support for it now is purely from the teeth out. But leaving that aside, let's focus on what possible alternatives could there be? Instead of being a problem for the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, why don't we use the agreement and some of its institutions and precedents as part of the solution? The reason I say that is this. I have mentioned this to other noble lords before. With some modest devolution from here to Stormont, perhaps based on trade issues and others, I believe we could create a situation where the democratic deficit created by the backstop, and there is one created by the backstop because under the backstop proposals, Northern Ireland would be receiving regulations from Brussels. It would have no representation there, and therefore you'd be a rule taker, you'd be effectively a European colony. And that would mean over time a gradual difference would emerge between Northern Ireland and the rest of the United Kingdom in terms of rules and regulations. And it does seem to me that it would be appropriate for a number of measures to be taken. We need to send a signal to our European colleagues that we take their single market seriously. And I think we need to make it clear that if anybody using United Kingdom territory to export to the European single market goods that are not compliant, that is an offence. I believe that we should create a new North-South body under the 1999-2000 treaty that deals specifically with cross-border trade issues. Now, I was Trade Minister for some years in Northern Ireland, and I set up 2 of the 6 cross-border bodies, one being Intertrade Ireland and the other being Tourism Ireland. And they have worked for 20 years. There are 6 bodies working, staff working on both sides of the border. There's no problem, there's no complaints, they get on with their business, and it's totally acceptable. I see no reason why that body should not have at least 2 functions. Number 1, educational. We both start with the same rule book and the same regulations. Any new regulations coming from either side could be notified to that body. It could then ensure that the totality of the people who use or do export into the Republic are advised of their regulations, and the same would apply the other way round. You could further ask them to ensure that if they see visiting depots and visiting companies any sign of inappropriate movement of goods or processes, that would be reported to the relevant authorities. Do you realise that as the backstop stands today, if it were implemented, goods coming from Great Britain to Northern Ireland would have to be treated as goods coming from a third country? Now, there was mention of that in some other speeches, but not in the context. That creates a huge problem for us, because it's the beginning of a separation process. And I think that is unnecessary, and I think it would be extremely difficult. The cry that we get from Dublin and from Brussels is we need an insurance policy, and I get that. And I think that insurance policy should be that the United Kingdom indemnifies the European Union by treaty that if our territory is used to export goods to the Republic that are not covered by European rules, then we have to indemnify them. And if we find that goods slip through, it would be our responsibility to them. So the insurance policy, because people can always smuggle anyway, whatever agreement you have, but it does mean that the insurance policy comes from us by treaty. With the cross-border treaty, you could join the EU to that treaty, so that the body that would operate and be democratically answerable both to Stormont and Dublin could in fact have EU observers, or they could be linked into the treaty, so there's no secrets, it's all above board. The North-South Ministerial Council, to whom that body would report, is an existing institution which is widely accepted, and of course we have the East-West dimension with the British-Irish Council, which could also have a role. So instead of the agreement being sitting there as a threat, it should be used as part of the solution. Now, there's all these technical things and trustor treaty trusted trader status. I get all that. But the big problem we have in Ireland is not simply technical. It's people feeling they've been shortchanged and they're in a situation not of their own making and it's out of their control. We can give them that control back. Now, my party doesn't have the technical backup and support necessary to work the detail of these things out. But at least the Taoiseach said the other day when we released it that he was prepared to look at it. Now, it's easy to say that, it doesn't mean anything. But all I'm saying is we need to spend our time, instead of having the referendum argument all over again, concentrating on solutions. Because it's only solutions that is going to avoid the difficulties of leaving the European Union in a disorderly manner. And that does not suit anybody in Ireland, north, south, east or west. And I certainly don't want to see it. But the other thing, folks, people forget. There is a land border of 300-odd miles, and we know all about that. But the vast majority of material moving between Ireland and Great Britain doesn't come across the border. It goes from Dublin to Holyhead, Fishguard to Rosslare. 80 to 90% of Irish goods travel on the British land bridge. And they either go to the UK market or they go to the European or world markets. 80 to 90%. The trade flows north-south represent 1/10 of 1% of EU trade flows. The total imports from the Irish to the Irish Republic from the whole of the world, only 1.6% come from Northern Ireland. And the vast majority of that is agri-food and animals. Now, it may be 1.6% of the imports to the Irish Republic, but of course it's a bigger percentage of our exports. And therefore, we have a lot of small businesses that depend very heavily on it. And therefore, it's a bigger deal for us than it is for them in many respects. Their problem is the exports to Great Britain, where, for instance, 55% of their beef comes to the UK. Huge quantity. That's not going to be replaced by other markets in 5 minutes, particularly if you get 45% tariffs applied to them. So let's bend our efforts and every sinew to finding solutions. There's no point in arguing over who said what in 2016 at the referendum. Everybody's to blame, because either sins of omission or sins of commission, and we all put our hands up for the legislation. So all I'm saying to you is, my lords, let's look at solutions. I accept what Lord Howell says. Those are technical issues which are part of it, but we need...
Is the noble lord not effectively saying that the whole of the British Isles should be part of one internal market and customs union?
If that is the case, why we leave the European Union? You see, the point is that if you're arguing that the referendum results in us staying in the customs union and the single market, then I don't see what the point of leaving it is, because the whole rationale was different. But it's all right saying here, folks, but don't forget it was the coalition government that brought this legislation into Parliament in the first place. So we've got to remember, as I said earlier, everybody has had their hands on this issue, and not always with distinction. So let us focus on solutions, and I'm talking about solutions that can actually work.
I've not spoken on a European issue for 2 years, and I'm...
Oh, sorry. I was giving way. I do beg your pardon. Well, look, maybe he's giving me a hint, and I didn't quite break the record of some of our other noble and distinguished colleagues in making the 20-minute mark. But I do urge colleagues that what we need to do is to be prepared to open our minds, because we don't want a disorderly departure, nor do we want the can continuously kicked down the road, nor do we want to retain the uncertainties that not having any solution brings. And I do think Her Majesty's Government, despite what people talk about the negotiating tactics, with what has been said by Chancellor Merkel and President Macron, I think probably the time has come to to put some solid things on the table, and then we can actually get to grips and have a proper negotiation. Because once things are on the table, people are going to have to say why they reject them. And therefore, if they cavalierly dismiss them, they will be weakening their own case in public opinion.
Lords, I'm very grateful I have the opportunity to speak. I've not spoken, as I said, for 2 years on European issues, and I certainly will not speak for 15 minutes. I accept my responsibility. I have been a pro-European all my life, very active in the House of Lords in European Union committees and very much in favour of staying in Europe. But I was responsible for us, in part, for coming out of Europe, like many other people, because I did not make the case for Europe with the public in the way that we should have done over the years. And certainly I did not play my part in the referendum campaign to the extent that I believe I should have done in retrospect. So I accept my responsibility. And I've been a Remainer from the beginning. But as I've watched the way changes have been taking place, and I've watched the way that the country, and not many people have really spoken about that today, the way the country has become ever more and more divided, I have recognised that I, for one, in accepting my responsibility, might have to shift my position from being a very clear-cut Remainer who wanted to go in principle and stick with Remain all the way. And I've shifted my view now. I am moving towards the deal that Mrs May reached. And I believe that, in fact, the more we talk about this, and I welcome this bill, because it does give us the opportunity, A, to have some time, B, to have a little bit more reflection, and C, maybe start bringing more people together who are prepared to make those little compromises between them to try to find a solution which will produce two results. One, it will take us out of Europe, which personally I do not want, but I am prepared to live with it, because I suspect that what is happening with us and what is happening in Europe, with the divisions taking place, and in America and all around the world, we are part of a peace, a shift, a change that is taking place. And I think it's not going to be stopped. So I am prepared to go in part with it. But I want, secondly, then, to have it in terms and conditions which are acceptable for the benefit of the people of this country, not going to immediately harm them, or even in the short term for a few years, but in fact will, as broadly as best, represent where they stand at the moment. And will go some way, if it is a soft settlement, towards ending the divisions that exist within families, within communities, and within different groupings, by bringing us close together. And that will be on the basis of coming out, one, secondly, a soft landing. And this bill provides us with that opportunity if we have people of goodwill. Because Lord Mackay put his finger on the solution which has been there on offer when Mrs May was at the end of her negotiations, which is in the political declaration, and I don't remember precisely which clause it is, but it is either 17 or 19, in which there is an offer from the Commission for further negotiations on the backstop. And this has not been pursued by anybody, but it is there, it is on offer, and it is time that people of goodwill came together, picked up the offer, and then would get a deal, I believe, which could come back to the Commons that would command the support of the Commons. And indeed, then I believe at the end of the day should be put to the people too, to have their view on it. So I have shifted, and I hope that if we are really serious about trying to find a way forward, and having listened yesterday to the almost the coarseness to which we descended in some of our exchanges, that we put that on one side and we come together as we truly should to try and represent the best interests of the people.
My Lords, I speak as a Remain voter, but one who is convinced that the referendum result must be respected. And I want to focus on the central issue today of trust. Now, there's been some really good points made on trust between this place and the government. I think particularly the noble Lords, Lord Hayward, Lord O'Donnell and Lord Kerr. I entirely concur with those points, but there's another angle to trust, and that's the trust between Parliament and the people. And that's the point I want to focus on today. So it was Confucius, I believe, who said that 3 things are needed for government: weapons, food, and trust. And if a ruler can't hold on to all 3, he should give up weapons first and food next. Trust should be guarded until the end. Without trust, we cannot stand. And I think that's absolutely right. Now, during the referendum campaign, the people were repeatedly told by the government that if we voted for leave, that is exactly what would happen. Now, if for whatever reason we do not leave, or even continue for many years with the current paralysis, following what we must remember was the biggest democratic exercise in British history, I think that would be fatal for trust in politics, which has already been much damaged by the events of the past 3 years. And many already feel that gulf between the so-called Westminster elites and the people, which will only be widened by that continuing. And the extremist politics we've seen on the rise in the UK in recent years could pale into insignificance from what could be unleashed if the vote was not respected. So what has that to do with this bill? It's a bill that rules out the United Kingdom leaving the UK without a deal. My lords, I understand the reasons of those noble lords who do not wish to leave without a deal. There have been many excellent points raised today about the difficulties of no deal. There would be much hardship, at least in the short term. But I work in business, as do many of your lordships. And I think to pick up on a point the Baroness Neville Rolfe made, I believe it's essential to hold no deal on the table, to keep no deal as an option, to ensure that we can get that leverage with the EU, that we maintain that leverage in our negotiations, which will result in a better deal for the UK. So in the end, my lords, this issue will be resolved via an election, but I believe a no deal must be maintained as an option to get the best deal for the UK and ensure that we do indeed leave and get the democratic will of the people seen through that vote. Thank you.
A very constructive debate today, much more interesting, much more wide-ranging than the long hours we had yesterday attempting to prevent today's debate. I welcome the noble Lord Forsyth on his return. I had understood he was on a sleeper train to Scotland last night. Perhaps he wasn't. But it's very courteous of him to...
Noble Lord has referred to me, and Baroness Hayter told me off for intervening because I didn't get here. I had to go and speak to a social care conference, and I came back at the first opportunity, which I would have thought was perfectly admissible. And whilst I'm on my feet, can I just correct him? What we were doing was preventing this House having a guillotine motion. It had nothing whatever to do with this bill.
All the more courteous of the noble Lord to return if he had a speaking engagement in Scotland. I regret that the noble Lord Dobbs, the noble Lord True, and Baroness Noakes have not had the respect for the House to be here today in those circumstances, having detained us for so long last night. And I hope that the Conservative whips will make it clear to them that respect for the House in these circumstances would have suggested that attendance was more appropriate in their circumstances for those of us who cut short our sleep and returned on time. But we are discussing some very fundamental constitutional issues in this bill, the issue of the relationship between Parliament and the executive or the government. And it's highly relevant to that the Leave campaign promised us that Brexit would restore not just British sovereignty, but parliamentary sovereignty. Listening to the noble Lord Howard reminded me of some of my history undergraduate studies of the 17th century conflicts, the emergence of the Tories and the Whigs, the Tories being those who defended the Crown against Parliament, and the Whigs being in favour of a stronger Parliament, although the noble Lord Howard refers now not to the divine right of kings, but to the will of the people, in some ways an equally difficult concept to pin down and define. These are very wide-ranging issues. The future of the Union has been mentioned. My son now lives and works in Edinburgh, and I have therefore been visiting Edinburgh much more frequently the last 3 years, and I understand that the future of the Union is at stake in this debate for Scotland and for Northern Ireland. And then the question which the Bishop of Leeds, my noble friend Lord Campbell and Lord Wilson of Dinton and others have suggested, which is, what sort of country do we want to live in? What sort of values do we think we are about? And do we think that European values are not ones that we share them more with the American right, and that's where we would like to be instead. We've discussed also the conventions of what we used to regard as our wonderful unwritten constitution, and the conventions which
I'm very grateful for the Right Honourable for the noble Lord giving way. May I apologise for my discourtesy, in his view, about not being able to be here for the entire debate today. I have attended the debate. I have been listening to his wise words on the monitor. Sadly, there are other duties which people must attend to, and I would be very appreciative if he would apologise for his discourtesy in, first of all, getting his facts wrong, and then personalising something which should be about politics and not about personalities.
The role of this House, the way we all conduct ourselves in this House, and the way in which we conducted our business yesterday evening, and I'm very happy to discuss this further with him off the floor of the House.
If the noble Lord would just give a little moment, because this is important. I have been referred to on the floor of the House, and I would just ask the noble Lord if he would simply accept the fact that these matters should be about policy and politics, not about personalities. And I hope that he will reflect on the fact that referring to personalities actually demeans his case and doesn't strengthen it.
I'm sorry, I have not read many of his novels, and I'm sure that they do not stress that personality is important in politics. It does seem to me it's rather difficult to disentangle personality from politics, but let us discuss this further off the floor. I will even promise to buy the noble Lord a drink. I was talking about conventions, the British Constitution, and I have to say I have been recalling the answer that the noble Lord Young of Cookham gave last year when the question was raised of the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments' sharp letter to the Foreign Secretary when he resigned about the way in which Boris Johnson broke the ministerial code in 3 places within 3 days of resigning. And the noble Lord George Young extremely carefully stressed that the ministerial code is an honour code, and it depends upon the honour of the men who sign it, and left the question of whether Boris Johnson is a man of honour hanging in the air. But that's part of the issue of trust which various members of the House have raised today, Lord Kerr, Lord Hayward, and many others across the House. The issue which we saw quoted in the Times today of whether or not the government might consider ignoring a law passed through Parliament if they didn't like it, increases the degree of mistrust. When the noble Lord Mandelson said that he cannot believe that the Prime Minister is negotiating in good faith, I think he speaks for rather a large number of people in the country, and that is worrying. And when he also says that we have to remember that the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff is in contempt of Parliament and has written a blog which shows many examples of his contempt not only for Parliament but for most politicians in all parties, then we are in a problem that we cannot trust this government. So Parliament is justified in tying its hands, as the purpose of this bill is to do. Then there's the question of the role of evidence in policy making and of civil service advice and civil service impartiality. The basis of the relationship between the civil service and government is that civil servants advise on the best basis of evidence which they can find, and that ministers decide. And what we've seen throughout this long argument about our membership of the European Community is ministers and politicians who disregard advice and push aside the evidence. I recall very well, long before we reached the referendum, of my time in government, when with David Lidington and Greg Clark, I chaired a committee which, at Conservative insistence, looked at the balance of competences between the European Union and the United Kingdom, which the Conservatives had insisted on in the 2010 agreement because they were convinced that the evidence would demonstrate that business and other stakeholders would want to claw back substantial powers from the European Union to the UK. As it happened, one of the most conscientious suppliers of submissions of evidence to the 32 reports that were provided was the director of the Scotch Whisky Association, Mr. David Frost. So he's been engaged in this for some time, and he clearly does know both what he's talking about and where the evidence lies. When those reports concluded that the balance of competences as currently established suited British business and other stakeholders well, the Prime Minister's office did its best to suppress debate further. I hope I misheard the noble Lord Howell when he suggested that David Frost was not perhaps pressing the Prime Minister's case on the Irish backstop as hard as he might in Brussels. I'm glad to hear that. I think we've seen a worrying number of occasions in which ministers have blamed civil servants for decisions that they should have taken responsibility for. Poor ministers blame officials in the way that poor workmen blame their tools. And Michael Gove on experts, David Davis on their officials, and others have lowered the quality of political debate in this country, and that's part of what we need desperately to rebuild. And in passing, may I say, this is not only a matter of government. The noble Lord Green of Dedington reminds us of the migration issue in this. I've read many of the Migration Watch reports over the years, good evidence, but presented to suggest that the migration problem from Britain is largely a European one rather than the global one, and that helped the Leave campaign very considerably, and I regret that mispresentation of evidence. Operation Yellowhammer is the most recent example of good evidence being presented by civil servants, so far as we understand it, and suppressed by the government because it didn't fit what the government wanted. Perhaps the noble Lord Callaghan, again, I may have misheard him on Tuesday, because I thought he said both, that the report was based on reasonable assumptions about the outcome of a no-deal Brexit, and that it was a worst-case analysis. When I worked in a think tank, we dealt in scenario planning, and one has central analyses, best and worst-case analyses, and I think I understand that Operation Yellowhammer was a central scenario analysis of the risks, and that the government should therefore be prepared to share with us what it thinks the potential risks of a no-deal Brexit are. My Lords, it's 3 years since the referendum. The main focus on negotiation has been within the Conservative Party and not between the UK government and the European Union. Theresa May, as Prime Minister, was pulled to the right by the European Research Group and imposed tight red lines. There could have been a compromise. Had the government said that we would have a soft Brexit, that we would stay within the single market and the customs union, everything would have been over and dealt with long before now. The fact that the red lines were tightened and tightened and tightened in late 2016 and early 2017 has led us to where we are today. And after 3 years, the Conservative Party is even more deeply divided, and we now see it crumbling at the edges with the Cummings purge, and even more with the resignation of Joe Johnson this morning, in which, as he said, that he is torn between family loyalty and the national interest. well, we do need politicians to think about the national interest, although I see Twitter remarked that this is the first occasion when a minister has resigned in order to spend less time with his family. My lords, the time remaining is short. The clock is ticking, the deadlines are approaching, and after 3 years of drift, without a clear government policy on what sort of exit we take, the idea that a deal could be reached on the 17th and 18th of October and implemented by the 31st of October is as absurd as some of the other things we have heard. As Lord Anderson remarked, the legislative basis for an orderly Brexit is simply not going to be there. So we will be going out without the legal framework which we need. That's not an orderly Brexit. So we need more time. We need more honesty about the choices, more respect for evidence, and for what is possible and what is impossible. We need a government and an opposition that put the national interest ahead of party factionalism. And since we do not have these qualities sufficiently in our national debate at present, we need this bill.
My Lords, I agree with the noble Lord Kerr, who said that it was a privilege to be a member of your Lordship's House and to participate in debates such as this. I would make the point that I've said that before, but I'm worried about being accused of dementia by the noble Lord Patton of Barnes for repeating my own previous speeches. But to listen to this debate today, to listen to the contributions which have come from such distinguished former civil servants as we've heard Lord Wilson, Lord O'Donnell, Lord Butler of Brockwell, and it's extraordinary. And of course, the quality of the contributions, I would like to say, is extraordinarily high. The thoughtfulness of this debate. And indeed, I'm going to make this point because we have been debating this now for today 6 hours. 6 hours, with I think over 40 speakers without any form of compulsion or even a speakers list have been able to make contributions. That's a very adequate way to allow this House to consider on second reading this bill. And that's in the light of what was said yesterday, that I think is an important thing to note. The bill is a simple bill, but a necessary bill. What it essentially does, of course, is to stop no deal, not stop it altogether, and that's what I want to make clear, and I can see the noble Lord Callanan shaking his head enthusiastically at this prospect, because it does allow a no deal if the House of Commons can be persuaded to pass a motion supporting that. Let me come back to that, and he'll obviously add what else he wants to do on that. But it's necessary because there is a real concern, and it's been referred to by a number of your lordships, of a lack of trust in the government, and that the government, unless it is constrained, will in fact allow us to crash out without ever having approved a final deal or had the approval of the House of Commons. As to the dangers of crashing out without a deal, a number of your lordships have referred to that. Now, we've talked about this on a number of previous occasions in this House, and on the whole, this House has very clearly indicated its view that leaving without a deal would be very detrimental. Today, we've had, in terms of risk to the economy, the noble Baroness Lady Bull, the noble Lord Billimoria, on the economy, for example. On security and the Union, we had powerful and compelling speeches on Northern Ireland from the noble Lord Mandelson, from the noble Lord Hayne, we heard from Lord Impey as well important aspects of that, and from the noble and learned Lord Mackay of Clashfern, and others. On Wales, from the noble Lord Wigley, and others. As to young people, the risk to young people and disadvantaged persons, from the Earl of Listowel, for example, and again I think from Lady Bull. These are the risks that we want to see avoided. The criticisms of the bill, from the noble Lord Howard of Lympney in particular, is that this distorts our normal process of the separation of powers. He has a rosier view of what the separation is, I think, than I do. But let it be clear, what this is doing is not preventing the House of Commons, which is the legislature, from giving its approval or not approval to an event, but saying that that is necessary before we could leave without a deal, or that there is an agreement which has been reached. It's also to be noted, given what has been said about hampering the Prime Minister in his negotiation, that the bill is clear that not until after the European Council meeting that is coming up on the 17th does the moment come when, if he hasn't reached a deal or hasn't obtained the consent of the House of Commons, he has to ask for an extension. So clause 1.3 doesn't trigger the need to ask for an extension until the 19th of October. So in those circumstances, that particular element of the concern is met. But I return to the point that's been made by a number of noble lords, the lack of trust in the government, which does result in a bill which is more constraining than one might hope to see. And I have to say this, as many other noble lords, what has happened in relation to prorogation is deeply, deeply concerning. It was deeply concerning when it was said that the prorogation has nothing to do with Brexit, when it was plain to all of us it had everything to do with Brexit. And we didn't need to see the documents which have been revealed in the Scottish case to know that. But now that we have seen them, we know that completely. And we know what is more, that a decision had been made in the middle of August at a time which was not revealed to the House of Commons, was not revealed to this House or to the people or to the public. That sort of, apparently or to the Cabinet, and that sort of concern, maybe I'm wrong to see in that a sinister approach, but it does mean that this House is entirely justified. The other place whose bill we are following, to want to, in the light of that lack of trust, to make sure that this does not happen without either an agreement or the other House having given its approval. As to whether that will solve the issue which a number of noble lords have raised, it's been said, well, this will not solve the problem. Well, that may well be right, but it does solve an immediate problem, which is the risk that we will find ourselves with a clock tick-tocking down to the 31st of October, not actually having a deal, not even apparently seeing any particular negotiations for a deal going on. And that worries a lot of us, I think, as well, that we don't see this deal. We talked about how, I think it was the noble Lord Krebs who first raised the point in an intervention, that the Prime Minister had said he needed 30 days, or he was happy to have 30 days to come up with alternative arrangements. The clock tick-tocked, and we didn't see what those arrangements are, and we still haven't seen what those arrangements are. So in those circumstances, to say Parliament is right, this House and the other House are right to insist upon a clear set of rules for what takes place seems to be absolutely the thing that we need to do. My Lords, one of my few regrets about this debate was what happened yesterday, partly because we spent a lot of time with bitterness and rancour, which is not what we want to see in this House. But we got, I'm glad to say, particularly due to the efforts of my noble friend, Lady Smith, of the Chief Whip on the government benches as well, to an agreement that we could all be happy with. That is important. I was also a little saddened because at the beginning of that debate, there was some confusion between me and the noble and learned Lord Faulkner of Thoroton. Now, normally it's extremely flattering to be confused with the noble and learned Lord Faulkner of Thoroton. I want to make that very clear. But this particular statements were made in the context of complaining that I had previously said things which I now appear to be disagreeing with by having made strong statements against the sort of motion that was being put forward. So I was a bit cut by that. Not quite as cut as I was by the young French waitress recently when I was on holiday with my family and our children and their friends, when they wanted to know, because there was a casino attached, what the age limit for the casino was. And the young woman turned to me and said, "There's no maximum age limit." Your Lordships may be relieved to know that and reassured, and I can provide the address of this excellent establishment if you would like afterwards. But the fundamental point that we want to make is that we support this bill. We're grateful to the other House for having sent it to us. We're grateful to the noble Lord Rooker, for having put it forward. We will have committee report and the remaining stage of the bill tomorrow. It would be very good if the noble Lord Callanan, when he whines for the government, could repeat the assurances that he gave in the course of the debate that the government will accept the bill, will make sure that it is in a position to get royal assent, and indeed, as I suggested in an intervention, that they will advise Her Majesty to give royal assent. I accept they can't promise what Her Majesty will do, but they can give advice, and we all know that the convention is that if advice is given, the monarch will follow it. But also that they will follow, as one noble lord was asking, the spirit. We don't want to see any tricks. We don't want to see any shifting. We don't want to see any little dodging around, whether they come from Mr. Dominic Cummings or anyone else, to get round this. If this House and the other House have said this is what should happen, this should be the bill, that it will be enforced and respected in the letter and in the spirit. So given the length of this debate that's taken place, and I apologise I haven't referred to a number of other noble lords for their excellent contributions, but I will urge the noble Lord Rooker to ask the House to give this bill a second reading, and we will support that.
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you very much to everybody who's spoken in the debate. And my lords, before I begin, let me please follow the statements of Baroness Smith and others and place on record the government's appreciation and thanks to all of the House staff, officials and noble lords for their efforts last night, for their cordiality and for their good humour from late into the evening, and it is appreciated by all of us. My lords, the public needs Brexit to be delivered on the 31st of October, and we simply cannot keep deferring through successive and potentially indefinite extensions. And let's be clear, let's cut to the chase. This bill is about crippling our negotiations. It's about stopping Brexit. It would tie the Prime Minister's hands, would undermine the UK's position, and it would make any further negotiations absolutely impossible. And let me respond directly to Lord Goldsmith's point. He is a distinguished lawyer. He will know, as well as I do, that this bill does not actually prevent a no-deal exit, because in one of the great ironies of this process, it is in fact now determined under European law, under the Article 50 process. The final decision on whether or not we leave the European Union is now determined by the European Council. Let me also add to the assurance that I gave him earlier that this government will, of course, abide by the law. And let me also repeat the assurances that the Chief Whip in this House gave last evening, that we have received a commitment from the Chief Whip in the House of Commons that Commons consideration of Lord's amendment will take place on Monday, and it is the government's intention that the bill be ready to be presented for royal assent then. Let me say a few words about the negotiations. As the Prime Minister reiterated in the other place on Tuesday, and the Secretary of State for exiting the EU said again on Wednesday, this government is committed to getting a deal. But it is a fact that this House of Commons has rejected the current withdrawal agreement 3 times, and it must now be clear to our friends and colleagues in Europe that it simply cannot therefore be the basis for a deal. That is why the Prime Minister wrote to President Tusk on the 19th of August to set out why a renegotiated deal must include the abolition of the anti-democratic backstop. We are confident that we can negotiate a deal which removes the backstop and which is acceptable to both sides. The European Council's own negotiating guidelines commit to looking for, quote, creative and flexible solutions on the border in Northern Ireland. The Prime Minister's EU Sherpa held his first round of talks with the Commission last week. He met with the Commission's Article 50 task force yesterday for 5 hours to discuss a range of issues, in particular the removal of the backstop from the withdrawal agreement. In addition, Both sides discussed the political declaration and the government's objective for an economic relationship that is based on a free trade arrangements. The talks were constructive, and both sides have agreed to meet again tomorrow in line with our commitment to intensify talks. And the House will also be aware, of course, that the Prime Minister is meeting the Irish Taoiseach Leo Varadkar next week. Our European partners do understand that we are serious in wanting a deal, and they are starting to reflect that reality in their responses. But, my lords, if you want to leave with a deal, you have to take no deal seriously. And this government has been completely clear in our commitment to leaving on the 31st of October. As the Prime Minister has said many times, he hopes and expects that that will be delivered through a deal. There is no reason why an agreement cannot be found.
To give way, please. I'm extremely grateful. Would he confirm and agree with his government colleague, the Cabinet Minister Nicky Morgan, who indicated on the BBC Radio 4's World at 1 at lunchtime that if the Prime Minister gets his way and there is a mid-October election and he wins it, he will repeal this bill or activate the clause within it to make sure that no deal occurs? Can he confirm that?
It's difficult for me to comment on an interview that I haven't heard. I'm sure the Noble Lord is quoting her words accurately, but if you will forgive me, I won't comment on that precisely until I've seen the details of what Nicky Morgan actually said. But we're commenting about a bill that has not been passed this House yet and has not completed its final stages in the other House. But I repeat that the government will, of course, abide by the law. I certainly can't predict what might happen in a future general election, and nor can I comment on what a future government might do with the bill in response to that.
Thank my old friend for giving way. In light of the comment made earlier today, the indication given earlier today, that the proposal for an election will be repeated in the Commons on Monday, has somebody in government checked with the Taoiseach as to whether he is willing for that meeting to go ahead?
As far as I know, the latest information is that that meeting is still going ahead, and even if there is an election happening, the government remains in office, the Prime Minister remains in office. There are still live issues to be discussed. I'm sure there will still be an intense value in having a meeting.
Can I be as usual of assistance to the Minister and help develop the strength of his argument and encourage him to be a very brave minister? Would he like to tell us that the Prime Minister's Chief of Staff, Mr. Cummings, who's featured quite regularly in this debate, did not say that the negotiations were a sham?
Always wary when the Noble Lord wants to be helpful, particularly when he quotes things taken straight from the pages of Yes Minister about being brave. All I can say is that he has not said it in any of the meetings that I have been at with him. Obviously, I'm not at every meeting with him. I can't comment on whether he did or not. He says he did not. I haven't heard anybody else in government say to me that he did. I know Dominic well, and I take his word when he says that he didn't say that. We know that Member States want to avoid a no-deal exit. And as set out by the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster in the other place on Tuesday, we have accelerated our preparations for no deal. For example, as I informed the House in my repeat on Tuesday, additional expenditure of 16 million to train thousands of customs, traders, staff and hauliers, additional 20 million to ensure that traffic can flow freely in Kent and the trucks arriving in Dover are ready to carry our exports into the EU. And of course, in addition to that, the Chancellor has made all necessary funds available to support other preparations. Now, my Lords, let me say a few words about the bill itself. And whilst today's debate has been, of course, of its normal high standards, it was remarkable that very few noble Lords actually addressed the legislation itself that we are talking about. But it is, of course, true that continued EU membership would cost the UK roughly £1 billion net a month. The bill, as it currently stands, would require the Prime Minister to immediately accept any offer made by the EU of an extension to the 31st of January 2020.
Noble Lord Minister, the £1 billion net which he refers to, I have seen frequently contested because it appears to be gross and to not take account of the expenditure that the European Union would make in this country if we were still a member. Could he perhaps clarify that?
Given the controversy about sums of money involved in our exit previously, I'm loath to get into that, but roughly I think it is a net figure. And our net figures are about 10 to 12 billion a year. I think our gross contribution was about 20, and we receive about 10, very roughly, from the top of my head, without looking at the numbers, back in receipts for agricultural payments, structural funds, etc. But if those figures are incorrect, I will write to the Noble Lord.
I thank the Noble Lord. Minister Gidway. So could the Noble Lord Minister just clarify, this £1 billion per month figure we're paying, we pay that anyway as part of our membership, which is just under £10 billion net, as the Minister said. We get the benefits of being in the European Union while we're paying it. So how can we say we're paying extra £1 billion when we're still members of the European Union?
Noble Lord is a distinguished businessman. I did not use the figure extra in my statement. I merely said that remaining a member of the European Union will cost us roughly £1 billion net a month. That is the current membership fee. We pay in a lot more than we actually get out from the European Union in pure financial terms. In addition, so I said that the bill would require the Prime Minister to immediately accept any offer made by the EU of an extension to the 31st of January 2020. If the EU offered a longer extension, or rather instructed a longer extension, whatever its date, regardless of its conditions, the PM would automatically have to accept unless the House of Commons says no within 2 calendar days. The fact that the bill mandates updates on negotiations and motions on those updates after the 31st of January 2020 and on a rolling 28-day basis with no end date clearly envisages either a lengthy extension or possibly a string of extensions. This, my lords, is a very poor piece of legislation. So if we pass this bill, in our view, there is no chance at all of renegotiating the deal before the 31st of October. It would completely undermine the government's negotiating position and the future talks that the government and the EU have committed to. Parliament would then be left with 3 unpalatable options. Firstly, revoking Article 50 and overturning the result of the referendum. Secondly, extension after extension, and therefore failing to deliver on the will of the people over 3.5 years after the referendum took place. Or thirdly, accepting the existing withdrawal agreement that has, of course, been rejected 3 times in the other place. And so I say to noble lords across this House, if you wish to accept the democratic decision, and I accept there are some parties that don't wish to accept that decision, that the UK is leaving the EU, and if you want to leave with a deal, then do not support this bill. The government remains committed.
I'm very grateful. Is my noble friend saying that if this bill passes into law, which Parliament, I think, believes it should, that negotiations will automatically end at that point? Is that what he's saying to the House? Is he saying that these negotiations, which are apparently continuing at the moment, which are doing very well at the moment, will suddenly be withdrawn from in a fit of pique? Is that what he's saying?
I'm saying it seems blindingly obvious to me that the EU has no possible incentive to negotiate anything, because the 2 options that then would be remaining on the table would be either revoking or the existing withdrawal agreement, both of which the EU are perfectly happy with. Why would they negotiate anything else once we have removed the option of no deal from the equation?
That in the political agreement, Europe offers further negotiations on the backstop. If so, why are we not picking it up?
Well, there are lots of negotiations predicated in the political agreement, but of course there are also arrangements within the existing withdrawal agreements for exploration of alternative arrangements. But the problem is that in the meantime we would have to legislate for the backstop, which then gives us no option unilaterally to withdraw from that.
Again, the noble Lord said there is no incentive for Europe. There are all the incentives there for Europe to negotiate a deal for us, and they have made an offer to us to which we have not responded unless the Minister tells us you have.
I'm struggling to see the point the noble Lord is making. Their offer is effectively the withdrawal agreement, which I personally thought was an acceptable compromise, but it is a fact that the House of Commons has rejected it. His party voted against it, the Liberal Democrats voted against it. Presumably there was something wrong with the withdrawal agreement then.
Well, my noble friend has vigorously supported the agreement, as did I, and as the Prime Minister voted for it on the third occasion, and therefore clearly agreed with it, or he wouldn't have done it, why don't we just bring it on?
I'm sure it hasn't escaped the attention of the noble Lord that Parliament as a whole voted against it on 3 occasions. Whatever view I took, or the current Prime Minister took, that this was an acceptable compromise, it has been rejected.
I'm very grateful for the noble Lord. I'm just thinking through the implications of what he's been saying, because I'd been hearing and reading that the Prime Ministers were saying, I am negotiating. In fact, the negotiations are going very well, which I took to mean that something was being discussed which he thought might be acceptable, not just the existing withdrawal agreement, and that he jumped at the idea when put to him by Angela Merkel of coming up with alternatives in 30 days. Is he now telling us that, in fact, if this bill passes, the Prime Minister will decline to negotiate any further? Is that what the government's position is?
No, that's not what I said at all. I'm saying it makes the government's position very, very difficult. Excuse me, sorry. It makes the government's position very, very difficult in terms of persuading the EU to do any kind of alternative deal, because all of the other options remaining on the table are perfectly acceptable to them. So this bill, in our view, as I said, would wreck any prospect for a renegotiated deal ahead of the 31st of October. It would not clearly honour the referendum result, and it would be another pointless and harmful delay, and of course would continue to contribute to the rancour that we are experiencing both in this House and in the public debate generally. So it will come as no surprise to you whatsoever that this government cannot support this bill, and I would like to urge all noble lords across this House who are committed to leaving the EU and to respecting the referendum to therefore vote against it.
Just before my noble friend sits down, could he say what he understands is meant by the agreement negotiated between the United Kingdom and the European Union referred to in paragraph 114 of the bill?
I don't have a copy of the bill in front of me. Obviously, we are not the sponsors of the legislation. The noble lord is a distinguished lawyer. I will decline the opportunity to clarify exactly what I think the proposers of this clause mean. It's not our bill. I will be happy to write to him with an opinion on that.
But my noble friend will know that a very distinguished member of the opposition in another place moved an amendment to this bill which makes it all the easier for the agreement that he so warmly supports, the Prime Minister voted for it to be voted on again. And the circumstances have changed. We have a new Prime Minister, so even the Speaker couldn't refuse a vote on it.
This is the so-called Kinnock Amendment that the noble lord is referring to. We believe, and we've looked at this quite closely, that this amendment is fatally flawed. It's contradictory to other parts of the bill. I apologise to noble Lord Kinnock, but we think the amendment is fatally flawed, contradictory to other parts of the bill, and we think legally inoperable.
Lords, I'm very grateful to everybody that's contributed. I'm merely the messenger in a way from the elected House, because that's what we're dealing with. A piece of fairly unique legislation from the elected Commons to try and deal with the uncertainties. I do appreciate, though, that my noble friend Lord Goldsmith or Callaghan, probably the only two that have actually spelt out, while the purpose of the bill is to stop us crashing out without a deal, the bill contains the mechanism for any Prime Minister who can pack the Commons to take us out without a deal. That's in the conditions in paragraph 1, and I've no doubt it'll be raised in committee. I've got 2 brief points. I have picked up from the sense of the debate that there would be a very high level of political immaturity in leaders in the other place if they buy an election before the 1st of November. It's quite clear trust has broken down. I think it would be absolutely balmy. That's my personal view. My final point, and I'm sorry about this, but it's a bit of a domestic policy issue. This bill is a private member's bill. It's a bit like the earlier one in the year in April, Cooper-Letwin. Now, at that time, because it was a private member's bill, the government front bench, who basically do the regulation of the chamber when things break down, went on strike. They removed themselves, and it caused us a degree of chaos in our administration. Now, today we've had a second reading without a speakers list. It's gone great because everyone could see there was enough time to get in to speak. Now, we've got a day on this tomorrow because after the events of April, as the member in charge of the bill, I complained to the Procedure Committee that if when a private member's bill is in the House the government doesn't agree with and the front bench goes on strike, the power to regulate should be given to the chair. So the chair could say, that's wrong, this is wrong. You know, no reply from the Procedure Committee, acknowledgement, just dismissed. But we're going into committee and report tomorrow. I have no idea about any amendments being tabled. And I don't want any chaos deliberately caused by the front bench abdicating their responsibilities if it needs help with regulation. It's quite clear. Early this morning, 3 hours, there was hardly anybody on the bench. Nobody took any notice of any breaches of procedure, and there were quite a few. Only one was picked up by my noble friend. So I would hope that tomorrow the government will live to its responsibilities. It has on that bench, irrespective of whether it agrees with the policy or the legislation, the House regulates. It's that front bench got the power. And if they're not prepared to exercise it, they should give it to the chair for the day. I beg to move.
I think he said in the morning that there wouldn't be time in the Commons for dealing with amendments, and therefore, on the whole, he'd prefer not to have them. Did I pick him up correctly, or is that wrong? Because I was thinking that I would like to see the purpose that's referred to in 1.4 in the letter.
I think the question has been moved. The question is that this bill be now read a second time. As many of that opinion will say content. Content. The contrary not content. So the contents have it. My Lords, in accordance with the business of the House motion agreed to by the House today, the bill stands committed to a committee of the whole House.
My Lords, third reading of the Parliamentary Buildings Restoration and Renewal Bill, Baroness Evans of Bowes Park.
My Lords,
My Lords, I have it in command from Her Majesty the Queen to acquaint the House that Her Majesty, having been informed of the purport of the Parliamentary Buildings Restoration and Renewal Bill, has consented to place her interest, so far as it is affected by the bill, at the disposal of Parliament for the purposes of the bill. My Lords, I beg to move that this bill be now read a third time.
The question is that this bill be now read a third time. As many as are of that opinion will say content. To the contrary, not content. The contents have it.
My Lords, I beg to move that this bill do now pass. In doing so, I wish to thank my noble friends, the Lord Privy Seal, Baroness Barron, Baroness Chisholm of Owlpen, for their work to ensure that the passage of this landmark bill. The bill, in the form that we now see it, is the product of excellent cooperation across all parties in both houses. I would like to thank noble lords for their engagement and cooperation in helping to create the robust measure that we have before us. In particular, the noble lords who served on the joint committee that carried out the pre-legislative scrutiny on the bill, and those who now serve on the shadow sponsor body. I express my gratitude also to those noble lords who contributed to debates and who tabled amendments, especially Lord Blunkett, Baroness Smith of Basildon, and Lord Wallace of Tankernes, all of whom embraced the spirit of collaboration and joint working, which ensured that the bill made swift progress without sacrificing the quality of the scrutiny it received. My thanks go to all other noble lords who tabled amendments and spoke at the report stage yesterday, including the noble Baroness Lady Wheeler. Lastly, let me extend my thanks to the excellent bill team, as well as the Restoration and Renewal Programme team, the shadow sponsor body, the parliamentary private secretaries, the whips on both sides, and of course the clerks for their support. My Lords, noble lords across the House have recognised the need for this bill, which addresses the pressing issue of the restoration and renewal of the Palace of Westminster, which has been improved thanks to their efforts. The consensus, the degree of consensus across both houses for the bill is reflected in its swift passage. I believe all of us have been keenly aware of how vital a step this is towards ensuring that the historic and iconic building in which we are privileged to serve is safe for staff and the public, that the works are delivered on time and on budget, ensuring value for taxpayers' money, and above all, that we have the right framework to secure the Palace of Westminster as the home of the UK Parliament for future generations. My Lords, I beg to move.
This bill do now pass.
My Lords, can I, on behalf of these benches and of my noble friend Lady Smith and Lord McNichol, who helped me take hold of the reins of the bill from our side when Lady Smith became somewhat otherwise engaged with developments elsewhere, and can I also place on record our thanks to the government for their cooperation on this bill and for the work of parliamentarians in both houses that have helped to ensure the bill is in the good place that the noble Earl and Minister referred to at the end of report stage. In particular, I'd like to thank my noble friends Lady Smith and Lord McNichol, the noble Earl Howe, and the noble lady, the leader of the House, for their work and commitment throughout the various stages of the joint committee deliberations and the passage of the bill. Can I also thank my noble friend Lord Blunkett, who plays such a key role in ensuring that public engagement and consultation and involvement of parliamentarians and staff in the project and the key issue of disability and public access are at the heart of the bill. The bill team, who I agree have worked in a particularly exemplary and collaborative way with your lordships, deserve special thanks, as does Beth Miller, who provides the noble Lord Blunkett with support, and our excellent team from our opposition office, Ben Wood and Dan Harris. Thank you.
My Lords, if I could lighten the atmosphere a little, I remember a Lonnie Donegan song, which was a reflection of the battle for the American independence, and it was the redcoats fighting a losing battle. There were fewer of us than there was a moment ago, and there are fewer of us in here than there was a few moments ago for fairly obvious reasons. But this bill is critical to the future, not just of the fabric and the well-being of the heart of our democracy, the Palace of Westminster itself, but to a futuristic look at how we can restore trust in and engagement with democracy. And I'm particularly grateful to all those who have played their part in making this a substantive measure that we can be proud of, on which the sponsor body of the Future and Delivery Authority will have clear direction in implementing. I won't repeat everyone who's been involved, but just to say I endorse entirely the thanks to those who have been part of it. My own personal thanks, not just to my own front bench, but to Earl Howe, who has reflected the best, I think, of the way we can conduct business in the House of Lords. I just want to finish by saying that I think that in implementing this bill and taking forward the kind of advice that we had from all quarters on all matters at the Joint Scrutiny Committee, it will be absolutely critical to draw down on the best possible expertise across the UK. And if we do that, we'll have something to be proud of in the years to come. Thank you.
My Lords, the question is that this bill do now pass. As many as are of that opinion will say content. To the contrary, not content. The contents have it. Report of the Sentencing Pre-Consolidation Amendments Bill. Lord Keane of Ely.
My Lords, in the absence of my noble and learned friend, I beg to move that this report be now received.
The question is that this report be now received. As many as are of that opinion will say content. The contrary, not content. The contents have it. Sentencing Pre-Consolidation Amendment Bill, Lord Keane of Ely. We've just done that, haven't we? Oh, carry-over motion. Yes? Okay. Sorry, that's the carry-over motion. So the question is that this motion be agreed to. Yes?
My Lords, I beg to move the motion standing in the name of my noble and learned friend on the order paper.
The question is this motion... I'm so sorry.
Motion is carried. May I simply say that we support the carryover. We would also like to say that we regard the handling of this bill in accordance with the Law Commission's fast-track procedure as a model of its kind. It's had a good opportunity for an airing. Nevertheless, there's been no substantial opposition to it, and it's plainly a necessary, though fairly technical, bill.
Motion be agreed to. As many as are of that opinion will say content. To the contrary, not content. The contents have it.
My Lords, I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
This House do now adjourn.
House of Lords sound. 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 House of Lords sound.